Daenerys could taste the salt on the breeze as she stood atop the ramparts of Dragonstone, her silver-gold hair whipping across her face. The sea below churned in dark waves, reflecting the battles yet to come. She had returned from Essos with her armies, her dragons, and her ambitions, but something had shifted in the winds of Westeros, something she could not quite name. Despite the strength of her Unsullied and the ferocity of her Dothraki, she sensed that this land would not fall so easily to conquest. Tyrion had warned her, repeatedly, that Westeros was not Slaver's Bay. The lords here were cunning, their allegiances layered like sheets of metal hammered into armor. And the one who intrigued her most was the king in the north, Jon Snow. There had been a flicker in his dark eyes, that day in the throne room, a moment of connection that felt as tangible as the stone beneath her feet. But it was more than just the tension of two rulers meeting for the first time. There was an echo of something else, some bond that neither could name. That day, she had not bent to him, nor he to her. But the memory of that meeting still lingered like a question without an answer. She let her eyes roam the horizon. Rhaegal and Drogon soared in the distance, beating powerful wings through the heavy sky. Viserion was perched closer, nearer to the castle's tall tower, as if standing guard over their new seat of power in Westeros. Something churned in her gut, an anxious energy that was not entirely unpleasant. She recognized it as the anticipation of a new campaign. She had not sailed across the narrow sea only to fail at the final hurdle. At her side, Missandei waited silently, her gaze drifting between Daenerys and the horizon. The translator sensed that her queen was lost in contemplation. Daenerys knew this war would be different. She had always been able to conquer, to break chains, to inspire devotion. But Westeros was filled with many who did not know her story or did not care. If she hoped to rule these 7 kingdoms, she would need alliances. She would need the North. It was Tyrion who emerged onto the ramparts first, his posture rigid but his look apologetic. The hand of the queen had spent the morning in some private consultation with Varys. Both men were as cunning as they were useful, and so she waited, arms folded against her chest, for his report. "Your Grace," Tyrion said, voice soft as the wind whipped around them. He nodded respectfully to Missandei, then turned back to Daenerys. "There's something you need to hear, or rather, something you should see." He spoke in that careful, measured tone that suggested the truth he had to share was heavier than usual. Daenerys felt a spike of curiosity. Tyrion was not one to mince words for the sake of politeness. If he was hesitating, it had to be something quite serious. She gestured for him to continue. "I trust you," she said simply. "Tell me." Tyrion glanced over his shoulder, as if verifying there were no unwanted ears upon the wind, and then spoke. "Varys received a raven from the north, a message from Bran Stark. We're not quite sure how it came, but he claims there is proof of something that changes everything." Daenerys's brows drew together. "The Starks have been known for their honesty," she said. "But what proof could a crippled boy hold that is so important we must discuss it in secrecy?" Tyrion licked his lips, searching for the right words. "He claims that Jon Snow is not Ned Stark's son at all." Daenerys stared at him, uncomprehending. She had heard rumors of Jon's parentage. Bastard of Ned Stark, some fisherwoman, some name she did not know. It never mattered much. But Tyrion continued. "Bran Stark claims Jon is the legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark." For the space of a breath, the sea fell silent in her ears, as if the roaring wind had suddenly died. She looked into Tyrion's face, searching for any sign that this was some witticism, some cruel jest. But there was only sincerity written there, along with an echo of his own astonishment. Daenerys heard herself laugh, a short, humorless sound. "Rhaegar Targaryen," she murmured. "My brother." Her heart constricted in her chest. Rhaegar had been a name she'd revered and dreaded all at once. The brother she never knew, the heir who might have become king if not for Robert Baratheon's rebellion. She knew only the stories Viserys had told her, and those had been twisted by bitterness. Rhaegar was a mystery, a ghost lingering in the songs of bards. Now she was being told that he had a son who lived, a son who was the king in the north. Missandei's eyes were wide, scanning Daenerys' face. Tyrion cleared his throat. "There's more to it," he said softly, as though the last blow was yet to land. "Bran Stark claims there was a secret wedding, a legitimate union, which means Jon Snow, or should we say Aegon Targaryen, has a stronger claim to the Iron Throne than—" Daenerys lifted her chin, eyes darting back toward the sea. Her heart pounded. A stronger claim. Could it be true? She had spent her entire life believing she was the last Targaryen, the rightful heir. The destiny that had been stolen from her family by a usurper was hers to reclaim. But if this was true, and if Rhaegar's son lived, then everything she had built her sense of purpose upon was unraveling. "Where is Varys?" she asked, her voice sharper than intended. "I want to hear this from him as well." Tyrion nodded. "He's waiting below," he said. "But Your Grace, we need to consider the implications before we act rashly. If it's true, if Jon Snow is truly the son of Rhaegar, that changes our strategies." Daenerys fought to keep her composure. Why had the Raven come now? Was it an attempt by the Northerners to sow division in her ranks? But that did not ring true of the Starks, especially the boy who possessed what they called the sight. "Let us go down and speak of this," she finally said, keeping her tone neutral. Inside, her emotions raged like a storm. "I will see this proof, and then we shall decide our next move." They retreated from the ramparts into the corridors of Dragonstone, which were lit by torches flickering in the darkness of the ancient castle. The echo of their footsteps filled the passage. Daenerys caught Missandei's worried glance, but the queen could not bring herself to speak. Not yet. She had to keep her mind clear, her heart steady. It felt like her very future was slipping from her grasp. Varys awaited them in the council chamber. The spider's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were watchful. He bowed perfunctorily. "Your Grace," he said, voice devoid of warmth. "I must confess, even I am taken aback by this revelation." On the table before him lay a neatly folded parchment. The seal was unbroken, as if waiting for Daenerys herself to crack it open. "This is the message from Bran Stark?" she asked. Varys nodded. His letter written in his hand. "Tyrion and I have read it. It claims that Jon Snow is the son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, born in secret at the Tower of Joy. It also says Samwell Tarly has found evidence in the Citadel that Rhaegar's marriage to Elia Martell was annulled, and he wed Lyanna in a private ceremony. Bran Stark swears it is all true." Daenerys felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She wanted to dismiss it as a lie, but the details were too precise, too carefully laid out. There had always been hushed rumors of Rhaegar's fascination with Lyanna, the spark that set off Robert's rebellion. Could it be that their union produced a child? "So Jon Snow," she began. "He isn't a Snow at all." Varys inclined his head. "Bran Stark refers to him by another name, Aegon Targaryen, the sixth of his name." The blood rushed in Daenerys' ears. Aegon. Rhaegar's first son by Elia had carried that name. Could her brother truly have named another child the same? That might be the final piece of proof. She exhaled slowly, controlling her voice. "Have you spoken to Jon of this?" Tyrion shook his head. "He doesn't know. The letter arrived while Jon was away on an expedition to Eastwatch. He's gone to gather more proof of the threat beyond the wall, you recall." Daenerys did recall. Jon had asked permission to mine dragonglass and to search for a white to bring south as proof of the White Walker's existence. He wanted to convince Cersei and the other lords of the Seven Kingdoms to unite against the Night King. Daenerys had, albeit reluctantly, agreed to this plan. But now her mind was spinning with other possibilities. If she told Jon the truth about his lineage, would that persuade him to bend the knee more readily or less? Or would it embolden him to claim the throne for himself? They were still reeling from the news when another messenger arrived. Someone from the northern retinue who had stayed behind in Dragonstone, an older man with dark circles under his eyes. He bowed before the queen. "Your Grace, I bring word that the king in the north has ventured beyond the wall. He travels with a small group including Ser Jorah Mormont, Gendry, and the Hound, among others. They intend to capture a white. The man paused. We haven't heard from them in days. A hush fell over the chamber. Daenerys instinctively looked to Tyrion, who lowered his gaze. The tension in her chest tightened. She had known the mission was dangerous. Beyond the wall, the dead roamed, led by the White Walkers. Yet Jon had insisted. He had insisted because he believed in something bigger than the Iron Throne. That thought lingered. All her life she had wanted the throne, to restore her family name. Jon had braved the land of always winter to save a kingdom that did not fully trust him. Daenerys lifted her chin. He should not face that alone, she said, her voice quivering just slightly. I've allowed my dragons to remain idle for too long. Varys and Tyrion exchanged worried looks. Your Grace, Tyrion ventured. Your army can't easily march beyond the wall, and taking dragons beyond the wall is risky. The Night King, Daenerys cut him off with a steely stare, is a threat that grows every day. Jon would not have gone if it weren't necessary. He is risking his life, and the lives of our allies, to bring proof that we must unite the realm. I cannot simply wait here while he faces death. In the back of her mind, the revelation of Jon's identity threatened to overshadow all else, but Daenerys refused to be paralyzed by it. She was a queen, and she had made a promise to stand against the White Walkers, as impossible as it seemed. As Tyrion began to argue about the logistics, Daenerys raised a hand. Prepare the dragons. The Unsullied will remain here to guard Dragonstone. The Dothraki could not traverse those cold lands easily. I will go with a small party by air. Her eyes flicked to Missandei, who looked ready to protest. But Daenerys offered a gentle shake of her head. You stay here, Daenerys said. I need you to keep everything together in my absence. If this is a trap, then I should face it alone rather than risk more of my people. She paused. And if Jon Snow is indeed a Targaryen, if there is truth to Bran Stark's claim, then we cannot let him die on some fool's mission. Our fates may be intertwined. The words tasted strange on her tongue, laced with the electric possibility that she was not alone in the world anymore. For so many years, she had believed herself the last. Yet if Rhaegar's line continued through Jon, everything changed. She took Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion north with her, flying over the vast whiteness that stretched like a frozen desert. Snow battered her face, chilling her through thick furs. Her heart pounded with each beat of Drogon's wings. She had flown dragons in Essos, but never like this, never into such hostile skies. The roiling gray clouds seemed ready to devour her. Yet she pressed on, trusting her dragon's instincts and her own. She needed to find Jon and the others. The knowledge of his identity burned through her thoughts. The shared Targaryen blood. Could it really be? When at last she spotted the small party hemmed in by the undead, her horror mounted. Jon and his men were stranded on an island of ice in the middle of a frozen lake, surrounded by whites. Their torches flickered weakly against the encroaching horde. Daenerys dove with Drogon, and her dragons spewed torrents of fire that cut swathes through the dead. Jon's face, upturned to her, was a mixture of relief and awe. The rescue was swift and brutal. As she landed Drogon to allow the men to climb aboard, she felt the chill of the army of the dead as though it clawed at her soul. The others rushed to Drogon's side. The Hound, Gendry, Jorah, Tormund, and others. One white, thrashing in a net, was proof of their success. Then she saw Jon, valiantly fighting off a cluster of whites to allow the others time to board. Her heart seized at the possibility of losing him. With each swing of Longclaw, Jon bought them precious seconds. She shouted for him to run. Their eyes met, a desperate connection across the frozen battlefield. At last, he turned to flee toward Drogon. But the ice shuddered, and before she could react, the whites swarmed, pulling him into the freezing depths. A strangled cry tore from her throat. Tyrion's warnings, the rumors of Jon's parentage, the claims of Bran Stark, it all vanished into panic. She had come too late. She could barely hear the others shouting. Her heart thundered. But then, Unbelievably, Jon burst through the surface of the water some distance away, gasping, half frozen, but alive. With frantic waves of her arms, Daenerys commanded Drogon to hover, waiting for Jon to scramble to higher ground. The whites were closing in, and the Night King watched from atop a rise. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold when she saw him draw the ice spear. She had witnessed these monstrous weapons kill a dragon in her darkest nightmares. Instinct roared within her. "Viserion, move!" Daenerys commanded, but it was too late. The Night King hurled the spear. She watched, helpless, as the weapon found its mark in Viserion's throat. The dragon screamed, an unholy sound that shattered the wind. Viserion collapsed, plummeting from the sky in a torrent of blood and flame, smashing through the ice with a terrible crack. The shock of it stole Daenerys's breath. Her child, her beloved dragon, gone in an instant. She almost lost her grip as tears stung her eyes, but she forced herself to remain. Jon, freezing and injured, staggered forward. She extended a hand, and he leapt, grabbed hold, and was pulled onto Drogon's back. They escaped, but barely. The flight back to Eastwatch passed in a haze of cold wind and heartbreak. Daenerys stared at the horizon, eyes unfocused, replaying the moment of Viserion's death again and again. She had lost one of her children. How could that be? Jon clung to her, half-conscious. She realized in a dim corner of her mind that if she had arrived even moments later, he would have been lost as well. The swirl of emotions that coursed through her was unlike anything she had known. Grief, relief, anger, and confusion. Because of the letter, because of Bran Stark's claims, he was no mere ally or potential lover. He was her nephew, the son of her brother. It made her feel dizzy, sick, conflicted. What did this mean for them? What would it mean to Jon himself? At Eastwatch, the men who had survived were given the best care that could be mustered. Jon was as cold as ice. It took hours to warm him, and at times Daenerys hovered nearby, heart pounding, remembering how he had risked his life for all of them. She recalled how he had spoken about the White Walkers, of their unstoppable advance. Now, after seeing them up close, she understood. This was no petty war for crowns. This was an existential fight for the living. She brushed the back of her hand across his pale cheek, half expecting him to awaken and challenge her presence. But he slept, chest rising and falling weakly. Guilt gnawed at her. If only she had believed him sooner, perhaps Viserion would still be alive. Perhaps a lot of things. She had come to rescue him, but it had cost her dearly. And there was still the matter of the Iron Throne. She feared that once Jon learned who he truly was, it might sow seeds of chaos between them. Yet gazing at him, she felt a fierce sense of protectiveness. Whether or not he was the rightful heir, she wanted him to live. The realm needed him, and more confusingly, she realized she needed him too. Jon stirred awake under the watchful eyes of Davos and Daenerys. He blinked, his eyes settling on her face with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. She watched him struggle to form words, his voice cracking from the dryness in his throat. "I'm sorry," he finally managed. She shook her head, swallowing back tears that threatened to spill. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she whispered. "You fought valiantly. You all did." He tried to push himself upright, grimacing at the pain in his body. "Viserion," he exhaled, a haunted look in his eyes. "I saw what happened." Daenerys nodded, lips trembling despite her composure. "He was my child." She didn't elaborate further. She didn't have to. Jon's gaze carried a heavy empathy, as if he truly understood the depth of her loss. In the quiet that followed, Davos discreetly excused himself, leaving them alone. The wind howled beyond the tower walls, a reminder of the threat that awaited them on the other side of that frozen barrier. Jon reached for her hand, surprising her with the intimacy of the gesture. "I wish there had been another way," he said softly. "You lost so much trying to save us." The unspoken question lingered. Was it worth it? She studied him, heart clenching with a mix of anger and protectiveness. "We needed that proof," she said finally, voice tight with unshed tears. And now I've seen them. The Night King, his army. Her grip on his hand tightened. I will fight for the North, for all of Westeros. The dead must be stopped. There was a long pause, and in the spaces between their words, Daenerys felt the weight of Bran's message. Should she tell Jon now? Part of her feared that if she did, it might fracture the fragile alliance they were building. She could see that he cared for her, in his guarded, honorable way. If he learned they shared Targaryen blood, that he was the actual heir, how would he react? Yet the truth burned in her mind. She could not hide it forever. Jon, she began quietly, there's something else. I received a raven. From Bran Stark. She paused, searching for the right words, and found none. He claims he has discovered something about your parents. Jon looked puzzled. My father was Ned Stark, he said, though there was an uneasy undertone in his voice. Daenerys took a shaky breath. Bran Stark says that Ned Stark was not your father, but your uncle. Your parents were Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. Her words seemed to echo, as though the tower itself recoiled. Jon's face froze, a mask of quiet shock. He almost laughed in disbelief. Then he saw how serious she was. That can't be, he said slowly. It's impossible. Ned Stark never. He wouldn't lie. Daenerys swallowed. He was protecting you, Jon. If Robert Baratheon had known of your existence, Rhaegar's heir, he would have killed you. Jon pulled his hand from hers, confusion etched in every line of his face. My father, if Rhaegar was truly my father, I'm a Targaryen? He whispered the word as though it were foreign, something he could not begin to claim. Daenerys braced herself, feeling her heart twist. You are Aegon Targaryen, the sixth of your name, she said gently, though the name tasted strange on her tongue. Bran Stark has seen it with his own eyes through his abilities, and Samwell. Tarly found proof of Rhaegar's annulment and marriage to Lyanna. You're not a bastard. You're the trueborn son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. Jon ran a trembling hand through his hair, struggling to absorb the unimaginable. He had lived his life believing he was an unwanted bastard of Ned Stark. To hear this truth now, after nearly dying beyond the wall, after forging alliances and facing undead monsters, his identity was not just upended, it was obliterated. Daenerys watched as a storm of emotions flickered across his face. Anger, disbelief, betrayal, awe, and something else. Fear, perhaps. If this is true, he said, voice shaking, then I have a claim to the Iron Throne? A stronger claim than you. He flinched as though the words themselves wounded him. Daenerys felt a tear slip down her cheek. Yes, she admitted, forcing herself to remain steady. Yes, you do. Silence fell between them, heavier than any snowstorm. Jon closed his eyes for a moment, as if that might block out the truth. I never wanted a crown, he rasped. I bent the knee to you because I believe in you. I still believe in you. I believe that you can lead us against the Night King, that you can help us save the living. This changes nothing for me. He opened his eyes, and she saw raw vulnerability there. I can't speak for the lords of Westeros, for the lords of the North. They might see it differently. They might see me as a rightful king. But I don't want it. I only want to protect the realm. Daenerys exhaled, relief and sorrow mingling in her chest. She believed him. Honorable to a fault, Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, had never sought power. He was a reluctant king to begin with, and now he found himself with an even greater claim. She reached out and gently rested a hand against his cheek. I know, she whispered. I know you don't want it, but we can't ignore what this means. If the people learn the truth, some will look to you as the rightful heir. There will be questions. Allies might shift. We cannot pretend it does not matter. Jon swallowed hard. Then what do we do? Daenerys felt the weight of the question. We fight the White Walkers first, she said firmly. We bring the proof to Cersei. We unite or we all die. The question of the throne can wait until we stop the Night King. Jon nodded, relief crossing his features. Yes, Yes, it must wait, but I won't keep this from my sisters, or from the people I trust. If we go into battle, they deserve to know who fights beside them. She closed her eyes. It was the right decision, though a frightening one. Once the truth spread, there would be no containing it. She might lose her position in the eyes of many, but another part of her, a more hopeful part, whispered that perhaps they could find a path forward. Together, she opened her eyes and met his gaze, seeing a reflection of her own tumultuous thoughts. "We'll face it," she promised softly. "All of it." When they returned to Winterfell, the atmosphere was tense. The hush of the North's raw winter seemed amplified by the presence of Daenerys's dragons, now only 2 in number. Word of Viserion's fall spread quickly, sowing both awe and fear among the Northerners who had never expected to see living dragons at all, let alone witness the cost of fighting the dead. Sansa and Arya Stark greeted Jon with a mixture of relief and guarded caution, especially when Daenerys arrived by his side. But it was Bran who truly unsettled everyone, sitting by the hearth in his wheelchair, eyes distant and strange. He met Jon's gaze and inclined his head. "I'm sorry," Bran said in his soft, faraway voice, "for the burden I've placed upon you." Jon's shoulders tightened. He glanced around at the few who had gathered in the dim hall: Sansa, Arya, Daenerys, Tyrion, Davos, and Samwell Tarly. The door was barred to keep others out. This was too delicate for open ears. "I understand," Jon said quietly. "I needed to know." Bran nodded. "Yes, now we must make choices. You and Daenerys both." Sam cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he addressed Daenerys, looking uncomfortable. He had once served her in his own small way, healing Ser Jorah from grayscale, but it was clear he felt torn between loyalty to the crown and to his friend. "I have the documents," Sam explained. "The High Septon's diary, referencing the annulment and the new marriage contract. It's unmistakable." Daenerys offered a small nod, feeling the weight of final confirmation. The truth of Jon's lineage was beyond dispute. Sansa's eyes darted between Jon and Daenerys. Daenerys could sense the protective suspicion radiating from the Lady of Winterfell. "Does this mean you've been lying to us?" Sansa asked Daenerys, voice cold. Daenerys squared her shoulders. "I learned the truth only recently," she answered evenly. "It changes nothing about the danger we face. The White Walkers are coming, and I have pledged my forces to fight them. That pledge still stands." Arya's expression was unreadable, but she studied Daenerys with that piercing, stark gaze. "What about the throne?" Arya asked, voice soft but pointed. Jon put a hand up. "I didn't even want to be king in the North," he said. "I certainly never asked for this. Right now, the Iron Throne means nothing if we're all dead. We must unite." Sansa's gaze flicked to Tyrion, then back to Jon. She nodded, grudging acceptance in her demeanor. Bran stirred. "We must prepare for the worst," he said, voice echoing with an authority that belied his youth. "The Night King has added a dragon to his army." Silence fell, thick as the snow outside. Daenerys' heart twisted at the memory. Yes, Viserion was now a creature of ice and death, forced to serve the very being who had killed him. The shock of it still rippled through her like waves of grief. "What do your visions tell you?" Jon asked Bran quietly. Bran's eyes became distant. "Nothing certain, only glimpses. The army of the dead marches south. They will reach Winterfell in due time. We must use every advantage we have." It was Tyrion who finally spoke, drawing them from the silence. "We need to rally allies from all corners of the realm, but that is a challenge if Cersei remains on the Iron Throne. We have the proof of the White we captured, yes, but Cersei might still refuse to aid us. We were supposed to meet her in the Dragon Pit for a demonstration. That was the plan." Daenerys nodded. "Then we will proceed with that plan. Let her see the dead for herself. If that does not sway her, nothing will." Sansa pressed her lips together. "And if it does not sway her? If she uses our distraction to strengthen her hold on the throne?" Jon exhaled. "Then we fight 2 wars. One against the dead, one against the living." Tension stretched in the flickering firelight. This was the grim reality. They stood on the cusp of the greatest threat the world had ever known, and Westeros was fractured by rival claims. Daenerys raised her head. "We must hold true to the promise of unity," she said, her voice firm. "I will march my forces north, the Unsullied, the Dothraki, and the dragons that remain to me. We hold Winterfell as our first defense. Once the Night King is defeated, if we can defeat him, then we will address the Iron Throne." She glanced at Jon, a silent question in her eyes. He answered with a nod. "And if the realm learns the truth about me," he began, but Daenerys cut him off gently. "They will eventually, but we stand together. We cannot let this truth tear us apart." She realized that in that statement lay her fear, that the revelation might set them against each other. But Jon met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw determination and a hint of warmth. He did not want the throne, and that was a comfort she clung to. Word spread slowly through the Stark household. People in Winterfell began to whisper that Jon Snow might be something else entirely, though the details were kept as quiet as possible. But even partial rumors were enough to raise questions. Still, the urgent threat of the undead overshadowed it all. Preparations for war began at a frenetic pace. The armory worked day and night forging dragonglass weapons from the supplies Daenerys had let Jon mine on Dragonstone. Ravens flew to the Riverlands, the Vale, the Stormlands, and beyond, begging for men to rally to Winterfell's defense. Some listened, heeding the king in the North's call. Others were uncertain, fearful. Daenerys felt the weight of every passing day like a stone pressing against her chest. They traveled south briefly for the fateful meeting at the Dragon Pit, presenting the White to Cersei. The undead creature's feral shriek silenced all arguments. Even the queen on the Iron Throne blanched at the sight. For a moment, Daenerys believed that fear might unite them, but Cersei's eyes, cold and calculating, revealed nothing. She agreed in words, promising her support, but Daenerys did not trust her. Tyrion implored Daenerys to accept the uneasy alliance, to focus on the real threat. Jon, for his part, made no move to proclaim himself Aegon Targaryen. He stood at Daenerys' side, the silent knowledge of his heritage burning like a hidden flame between them. As they left King's Landing, wariness settled in Daenerys' mind. She did not believe that Cersei would actually send her forces north to help. Jon shared her doubts but could offer no alternatives. They returned to Winterfell, preparing for the inevitable. The quiet days before the storm were the hardest, each breath laced with dread. Daenerys took to walking the battlements at night, haunted by dreams of Viserion's fall. In those dreams, she saw the Night King's spear tear through the hearts of Rhaegal and Drogon, too. Then she would wake, gasping, the taste of ashes in her mouth. Jon found her one such night, alone in the courtyard. The lantern light illuminated his face, showing the lines of worry etched there. Wordlessly, he joined her, the cold northern wind ruffling his dark hair. She felt a subtle pull toward him, a mixture of kinship and an emotion she dared not name. If the truth of their blood had come sooner, would they have kept a respectful distance? Or had fate already woven them together? He broke the silence. "We don't know if the dragons can stand against the White Viserion," he said quietly, "or if the walls of Winterfell can hold." She nodded, feeling the ache in her chest. "We must try," she replied. "I have lost one child. I won't stand idle and lose another." Jon turned to face her, dark eyes searching. "You're not alone," he said softly. "The North stands with you, as do I." The flicker of sincerity in his gaze made her chest tighten. They had forged something out of necessity, out of respect. But what form that bond would take now remained uncertain. Days slid by like melting icicles. Reports came from scouts that the army of the dead advanced, unstoppable in its slow march. The day finally arrived when the horns sounded from atop the walls, announcing the approach of an enemy. Daenerys stood on the ramparts, Jon at her side, gazing out across the field. It was a sight that defied belief. Thousands upon thousands of whites, a sea of pale flesh and bone, creeping forward under a bleak sky. Among them strode white walkers on dead horses, their spears of ice glinting. High above, they saw the silhouette of Viserion, his once-living form twisted into a mockery of life by the Night King's magic. Blue fire flickered in the dragon's maw, a horrifying counterpart to the flames Daenerys's dragons breathed. The battle began in chaos. Daenerys took flight atop Drogon, with Rhaegal flanking them. She unleashed fire upon the dead, scorching them by the hundreds. But the mass seemed endless. The living clashed with the dead on the fields outside Winterfell, steel ringing against brittle bone. Jon led the ground forces, sword in hand, Ghost darting by his side. The combined armies of the North, the Vale, the Riverlands, and the few southern houses that answered the call fought valiantly, but the dead pressed on relentlessly. Daenerys's heart pounded as she guided Drogon into sweeping arcs, burning as many whites as possible. She spotted Arya and Sansa upon the battlements, coordinating archers. Tyrion and Davos barked orders, but the lines of the living buckled. A piercing shriek tore through the sky, and Daenerys's blood ran cold. Viserion dived toward Rhaegal, ice-blue flames erupting from his jaws. The two dragons collided in midair, a terrible dance of tooth and claw. Rhaegal roared in agony, but did not fall easily. He raked at Viserion's decaying flank with savage fury. Daenerys spurred Drogon to assist, tears blurring her vision at the sight of her children tearing each other apart. Her faithful Drogon spewed fire at Viserion, who shrieked in pain as flesh sloughed from his undead form. But the Night King was there, perched on Viserion's back, his icy gaze locked upon Daenerys. She felt a spike of terror. He raised his spear once more. Her instincts screamed to evade, but Viserion breathed those blue flames, forcing Drogon to swerve at the last moment. On the battlefield, Jon saw the swirl of dragons overhead. He realized the Night King was exposed. Urgently, he fought his way through a throng of whites, slashing and dodging. Tormund and Brienne flanked him, their weapons slicing at the dead. Jon shouted, "We must get to the God's Wood." The plan had been to draw the Night King there, to lure him close to Bran, who waited with Theon's iron-born guard, hoping the ancient magic of the Weirwoods and the possibility of a trap might end this. But the battle's chaos had scattered them. Overhead, Viserion and Rhaegal continued their deadly struggle, neither fully giving ground. Drogon circled, Daenerys desperately trying to find an opening to blast the Night King from Viserion's back. At last, a chance presented itself. The Night King shifted to hurl his spear, but Rhaegal battered into Viserion's flank, throwing off his aim. The spear sailed wide. Daenerys seized the moment, Drogon unleashing a torrent of dragonfire upon the Night King. For a heartbeat, the cold tyrant vanished in the flames, and she dared to hope. But as the fire subsided, he emerged, unharmed, his face a mask of icy malice. He lifted his gaze to her, and Daenerys felt a chill down her spine. He soared away on Viserion's back, heading for the heart of Winterfell. She wheeled Drogon around, urging him to follow, but the swirling snow and smoke made it hard to track their flight. On the ground, the whites poured through the broken gates of Winterfell, clashing with the defenders in the courtyards. Sansa directed those who could fight, sending others into the crypts. Arya flitted through the shadows, silently dispatching whites with her dagger of Valyrian steel. Above it all, Bran waited in the God's Wood, eyes rolled back as he slipped into warging, scouting the battlefield through ravens. The sense of creeping doom was palpable. Daenerys circled overhead again, scanning for any sign of the Night King. She had lost sight of Rhaegal in the swirling snow. Her heart pounded with worry for her other dragon child, but the battle pressed on. Suddenly, she saw it. A flash of sickly blue flame in the God's Wood. The trees glowed with the unholy light. "No," Daenerys whispered, guiding Drogon into a dive. As they landed, the scene before her was chaos. Theon's Ironborn lay scattered, some dead, some desperately trying to hold back whites from reaching Bran. The Night King stood at the edge of the small clearing where the weirwood tree rose, white bark stained with splatters of blood. He dismounted Viserion with an eerie grace. Bran was there, eyes returning to normal, Theon kneeling at his side, spear in hand. Daenerys leapt down from Drogon, ignoring Tyrion's earlier warnings not to place herself at such risk. This was it. If they killed the Night King, the dead would fall. All of this would be over. She commanded Drogon, "Dracarys!" Fire erupted, bathing the Night King in heat and flame. Once again, Daenerys prayed it would end him. But as the inferno subsided, he emerged unscathed, icy spear in hand. Drogon roared and raged. The Night King hurled the spear. Daenerys saw the glint of ice and realized it was aimed at Drogon's head. She shouted, stepping forward, but there was no time to act. The spear struck Drogon in the shoulder, sending him reeling back in a shriek of pain. He stumbled, wings flailing. Daenerys cried out, tears hot in her eyes. She rushed forward, even though it was madness. In that moment, Theon charged the Night King, desperation fueling him. He thrust his spear, but the Night King sidestepped easily, snapping the weapon in two with inhuman strength. He plunged a shard of it into Theon's chest. Theon fell, life leaving his eyes. Bran watched with a calm that was eerie, as though he had already foreseen it. Yet, at the same time, Daenerys saw heartbreak flicker in Bran's gaze. Theon had redeemed himself in this final stand, but it seemed in vain. Jon burst into the clearing, panting, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. He saw the Night King, raised Longclaw and lunged. Their blades clashed, Valyrian steel against ice. Sparks of frost erupted. Daenerys circled, seeking an opening. Her only weapon a small dagger of dragonglass. She had no illusions about her odds in a melee with such a creature, but desperation lent her courage. The Night King shoved Jon back with supernatural force. Jon slammed into the trunk of the weirwood, dazed. The undead king stepped forward, raising his ice blade to deliver a finishing blow. Daenerys did not hesitate. She leapt at the Night King's back, driving her dragonglass dagger at the only vulnerable spot she could reach. He whirled, too slow to avoid the strike entirely. The dagger pierced his side, a hiss of steam erupting as his flesh met dragon glass. His other hand lashed out, striking Daenerys with bone-shattering force. She flew back, crashing into the snow, pain radiating through her body. Gasping, she looked up. A fracture spread across the Night King's side, a web of cracks forming over his icy skin. But he did not fall. He turned his attention to her, cold malice burning in eyes of cerulean flame. Jon, regaining his bearings, saw Daenerys in peril. With a roar, he took his chance. He surged forward, Longclaw swinging, channeling all his strength. The Night King, wounded, raised his weapon to parry, but he was a fraction too slow. Longclaw sliced into the same spot where Daenerys's dagger had lodged, burying itself in ice flesh that had already begun to crack. The Night King's face contorted in what might have been shock or rage. Then he shattered, bursting into fragments of ice that glimmered in the moonlight before dissolving into swirling snow. At once, the whites around them collapsed, empty husks dropping to the ground. A stunned hush fell over the godswood, broken only by the ragged breathing of the living. Daenerys slumped forward, every bone aching. She struggled to her feet and looked around. Bran remained unharmed, his expression distant but tinged with relief. Jon stood panting, Longclaw still clutched in his hand, wide-eyed. "We did it," he breathed, voice thick with disbelief. Daenerys nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. She rushed to Drogon, who lay bleeding from the spear wound. Pain lanced through her as she saw how badly it had struck. The spear had penetrated deep into the dragon's flesh, black blood oozing. Drogon's breathing was labored. She pressed her hand to his scaled flank. "No, no, no," she whispered, horror gripping her. "Stay with me, my child." Drogon rumbled weakly, one great eye flickering. Jon joined her, carefully placing a hand on Drogon's side. "We'll do what we can," he said, though his face told her the wound was grave. The last of Daenerys' strength was poured in. To soothing Drogon, She did not know if the wound would prove fatal or if her dragon could heal in time. But at least the endless threat of the undead was gone. The Whites had fallen, and the White Walkers had perished with their king. Viserion's undead form lay in a twisted heap near the walls, also crumbling slowly to chunks of ice and rotted flesh. The sorrow of that moment was immeasurable, overshadowed only by the relief that the living had triumphed. Barely. Word spread through the castle. The Night King was slain. The army of the dead was defeated. Wild cheers of victory mingled with weeping for the countless dead, for the sacrifices made. Winterfell's once proud courtyards were a scene of carnage, but the living had survived. Daenerys limped to the walls, ignoring her own injuries. She looked over the broken battlements at the fields littered with corpses, both white and living. Jon followed, weary, stained with blood and ice. They stood side by side, letting the enormity of it all sink in. In the days that followed, the people began to recover the dead for burial. There was a solemn procession through the Godswood for Theon Greyjoy, who had died protecting Bran. Daenerys tended to Drogon, who lay in the courtyard, too weak to move for several days. Rhaegal had survived his aerial battle with Viserion, albeit scarred and wounded as well. Jon spent hours with her, sharing the weight of leadership. Now that the existential threat was ended, other questions came roaring back. The Iron Throne, the Southern Lords, the rumors of Jon's parentage. Sansa addressed these questions head-on. She summoned the Northern Lords to Winterfell's Great Hall to witness an announcement. Daenerys and Jon both stood at the front, flanked by Tyrion, Arya, Bran, and Davos. The lords and knights who survived the battle watched with wary eyes. Sansa's voice rang out. "We have all seen the price of war, of strife among ourselves while the dead threatened us. Yet we prevailed. We owe that victory to many brave souls. Queen Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons, the northern armies, the Knights of the Vale, the Lords of the Riverlands, and of course Jon Snow, the king in the north. But there is more we must share." She gestured for Jon to step forward. He did so, looking uneasy but resolved. His gaze swept across the hall, meeting many eyes, those of Lyanna Mormont, of Glover, of Royce. "I am not who you believed," Jon began, voice steady. "I learned the truth of my parentage. My mother was Lyanna Stark. My father was Rhaegar Targaryen. I was born Aegon Targaryen, sixth of my name." A ripple of shock traveled through the hall. Murmurs erupted. Some faces showed confusion, others betrayal, still others a flicker of hope or curiosity. Jon lifted his hand. "I tell you this not to lay claim to the Iron Throne, but because I will not live a lie. Ned Stark raised me. He taught me honor, taught me duty. I mean to defend these lands, to serve these people. But I cannot hide what I am." The lords exchanged looks. Daenerys stood beside him, calm but tense. She knew that everything hung in the balance of their reaction. If they demanded Jon press his claim, if they turned on her, what then? Sansa stepped forward. "He was and is our brother," she said firmly, voice carrying a note of finality. "He fought for the North. He bled for it. In my eyes, he is still a Stark as well as a Targaryen. He might have a claim to the throne, but he stands beside Queen Daenerys, who gave her armies and lost her dragon to save us." Her sharp gaze challenged any who might object. Arya, standing near the front, nodded in agreement. Tyrion cleared his throat. "The question remains. What do we do next? The dead have been defeated, but Cersei Lannister still holds the Iron Throne. She promised aid, which never arrived, indicating she has no intention of relinquishing her power. The realm is fractured. Lyanna Mormont was the first to speak up from among the Northern Lords. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, whatever name he bears, he's proven himself to the north. I'll follow him." She then shot a fierce look at Daenerys. And the Dragon Queen honored her promise, risking her own life and losing one of her beasts. "I won't forget that." Some murmured in agreement. Others stayed silent, processing the revelation. Finally, Yohn Royce stood. "We swore to defend the realm. Jon Snow was chosen king in the north. If he stands by Daenerys, so will we." A sense of guarded unity filled the hall. It was not unconditional devotion, but a grudging respect born of shared sacrifice. For now, it seemed enough. Daenerys felt relief bloom in her chest. She reached for Jon's hand, and though it felt odd, knowing what she knew about their blood ties, she grasped it anyway. In that moment, they were allies, partners in shaping Westeros's future. In the weeks that followed, the healing began. The snows lingered, but the knowledge of the undead threat had melted away. Daenerys oversaw the slow recovery of Drogon, using every bit of skill that her healers and dragon keepers possessed. Rhaegal circled the skies above Winterfell, protective and watchful. Jon worked closely with Sansa, Arya, and Tyrion to manage supplies and re-establish trade routes that had been disrupted by the war. Word of the Night King's defeat spread across the realm, carried by bards and ravens. Some celebrated the Targaryen queen as a savior, others resented her presence, fearing she would assert her claim by fire and blood. Meanwhile, rumors of Jon's parentage reached every corner of Westeros, fueling speculation about a potential rivalry. But none of that overshadowed the looming confrontation with Cersei. If she would not willingly relinquish the throne, war was inevitable. Daenerys had lost enough. She had no desire to see more blood spilled, but she would not let the Seven Kingdoms languish under the rule of a queen who broke her word and spurned unity even in the face of the end of the world. She and Jon discussed strategies, always returning to the question: who should rightfully sit on the Iron Throne? Jon insisted he did not want it. Daenerys had dedicated her life to claiming it, yet she found herself uncertain now. A gentle conflict brewed between them, unspoken yet palpable. At last, Daenerys called a council in the Great Hall. This time, the participants were chosen not just from the north, but from those lords of the Vale, Riverlands, and even a small delegation from Dorne who had come north after hearing the news of victory. Gendry, newly legitimized as a Baratheon by royal decree from Daenerys, represented the Stormlands. Samwell Tarly stood for the Reach, though that seat was contested after the destruction of House Tyrell. Each region had a voice, and each awaited the Queen's plan. Daenerys stood before them, regal in her dark furs, the three-headed dragon sigil gleaming on her chest. "You all know what we have suffered to end the long night," she began. "Now we must address the fate of the Iron Throne. Cersei Lannister holds King's Landing, but she stands alone, refusing to ally with us against the dead. We have survived the greatest threat to the living by standing together. Now we must stand together once more, to liberate the realm from a tyrant who would let us all perish for her ambition." She let her words settle. The hush that followed was thick with anticipation. Tyrion stepped forward. "We propose to march south with a combined host. The North, the Vale, the Riverlands, Dorne, the Stormlands, and those forces loyal to the Targaryen claim. We will offer Cersei a final chance to surrender peacefully. If she refuses, we lay siege to King's Landing. But we do so carefully. We do not wish to repeat the atrocities of the past." His eyes flicked to Daenerys, referencing the events of her father's reign. She had vowed never to be like the Mad King. She would not burn the city to ash, no matter the provocation. Jon regarded the gathered lords. "Cersei must be removed for the realm's good," he said simply. "Our people have endured too much. We must do this swiftly and with as little bloodshed as possible." Gendry spoke up. "I'll march my men. House Baratheon was wronged by the Lannisters. We owe them no loyalty." Dorne's representative, a young noblewoman of House Dane, nodded in agreement. "The Martells are gone, but we have not forgotten the crimes of the Lannisters. We stand with you." Slowly, the lords voiced their consent. The time for war had come again, but this time it was a war to unify the realm under a single crown. After the council, Daenerys found Jon alone in the Godswood, the red leaves rustling overhead. He seemed pensive, staring at the heart tree. "I was never comfortable as king in the north," he said quietly as she approached. "Now some are calling me the heir to the Iron Throne. All I ever wanted was to keep my people safe." She stepped beside him, her breath visible in the cold air. "They are safe now," she said, letting her hand rest lightly on his arm. "Safer than before, at least. We did that, Together. He turned to her, eyes reflecting the faint light. "I won't fight you for the throne," he said firmly. "I don't want it. My loyalties have always been to the north, and to you." She felt her heart clench. The conflict within her was still there. Had she not yearned her entire life to reclaim the throne for her family? She was the mother of dragons, the breaker of chains, the rightful queen. Yet standing here, she realized that the realm might be better served by a ruler who understood its people, who had proven his willingness to sacrifice everything. A part of her wanted to yield, but pride and legacy warred in her heart. Before she could respond, Jon reached for her hand. "If we take King's Landing," he said softly, "if Cersei is deposed, then we have a chance to shape the future of Westeros together. Maybe we find a new way, something better than one person ruling all by fear." She studied him, 1,000 questions spinning in her mind. "What would that even look like?" she asked, her voice tremulous. "Breaking the wheel," Jon whispered, echoing the words she had once used. "Perhaps we break it together." She felt an ache in her chest that was both hope and sadness. The line between them was tangled by blood, destiny, and personal longing. She remembered the closeness they had shared on the boat to White Harbor before the undead threatened everything. She recalled the tender brush of lips, the way they had found comfort in each other. Now, that bond was complicated, yet it endured. Preparations for war continued at a relentless pace, though it would be some weeks before the full combined host was ready to march south. Daenerys traveled with Jon to the Riverlands, forging alliances, securing provisions. Everywhere they went, the talk was of how the king in the north, a newly revealed Targaryen, and Daenerys Stormborn had slain the Night King. Some called them heroes, others whispered about unnatural relations. But in the presence of the two, lords and commoners alike recognized their resolve. The unstoppable nature of their combined leadership was a beacon. One evening, after a long day of negotiations, Daenerys found Jon alone in his tent, studying a map by candlelight. She entered quietly, and he looked up with a smile that made her heart twist. He gestured for her to sit, pouring a cup of wine. They spoke in hushed tones about the next day's journey, about supply lines, about the Tullus who had offered them partial support. When they fell silent, a tension hung between them. Daenerys gazed at the flame of the candle flickering in the drafty tent. "How do you truly feel?" she asked softly. "About the throne, about the North." Jon exhaled. "I'd be lying if I said I didn't fear losing the North's trust. They named me king after all. But the truth is, my father was Rhaegar. I may have the blood of the dragon, but I'm still just me, a man who wants to protect his home. If sitting on the throne is the best way to protect the realm, I'd do it, but not without you." He paused, eyes lowered. "Though we both know how people would talk. The Targaryens of old married amongst themselves to keep the bloodline pure. That practice is frowned upon now, but there are those who might demand we unite our claims." He looked pained, as though the thought troubled him deeply. Daenerys's cheeks flushed. It had crossed her mind, more than once, that a marriage between them would quell the questions of succession and unify Westeros behind a single, Targaryen-led banner. But the knowledge that Jon was her nephew by blood weighed heavily on her conscience. She had grown up hearing her brother's twisted sense of entitlement, the mania that it brought. Was this the same path? Or was the world different now, less tolerant of such practices? She cleared her throat. "I don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past," she said quietly. "And yet, the realm has always turned a blind eye to such things when it suited their politics." Jon nodded, conflict etched in every line of his face. He reached for her hand. "I cannot deny my feelings for you, Daenerys," he said, voice low. "But we must be cautious. We must do what's best for the realm, not simply follow our own desires." A sad smile touched her lips. "I know." They sat together in that hush, aware that the final storm still lay ahead of them in King's Landing. In the end, they marched south with an army that dwarfed the forces either side had mustered in recent history. The battered Northmen, hardened by their victory over the undead, joined ranks with the fierce Dothraki, the disciplined unsullied, the Knights of the Vale, and contingents from nearly every corner of the realm. 2 dragons soared overhead, both still nursing wounds from the great battle, but capable of raining fire from the skies. Cersei's men prepared the defenses of King's Landing, bracing for the siege. Scorpions lined the walls designed to fell dragons. Daenerys felt a jolt of anxiety upon seeing them, remembering Viserion's fall and Drogon's wound. But Tyrion and the War Council had planned carefully. They would not repeat the mistakes of the Field of Fire. Tension crackled as the living army encircled the capital. Daenerys sent one final message to Cersei, demanding her unconditional surrender. In response, the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms had a volley of bolts fired at the approaching lines. So the siege began. For days, the city was locked down, the gates sealed, and the lords who remained inside bickered and panicked. Food grew scarce. Daenerys ordered her forces to blockade trade routes but not to harm small folk trying to escape, allowing a corridor for civilians to flee. This act of mercy swayed many in her favor. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. The gates were breached by a combination of siege towers and the might of the Dothraki horde. The streets of King's Landing erupted in chaos. Daenerys flew above with Drogon, carefully targeting the scorpions on the walls. Rhaegal circled to the other side, blasting the enemy from the flanks. Within the city, Jon led ground forces, forcing the Lannister troops to either surrender or be overrun. Slowly, block by block, the living army advanced, and panic set in among the defenders. Smoke filled the air, tinted red by the flames of war. Daenerys recalled the day she had marched on Astapor and Meereen, the day she had freed countless slaves. This was a different kind of conquest, complicated by the memory of her father's cruelty, the knowledge that she must not succumb to the temptation of wanton destruction. She guided Drogon with a heavy heart, focusing on strategic targets. The scorpions, the battlements. She refused to raise the city. The small folk took to the streets, some fleeing, some cheering, some cursing the Targaryen queen. Jon's forces pressed deeper, cornering the last loyalists of Cersei near the Red Keep. At last, the bells of King's Landing tolled, a peal of surrender that reverberated through the smoky sky. Daenerys reined Drogon in, heart pounding. The city had yielded. The war was over. Yet bitterness clung to her, because Cersei herself had not emerged. The Red Keep still loomed, silent and menacing. Jon's voice came over the din. To the keep! He led a contingent forward. Daenerys landed Drogon in the courtyard. Together, they ascended the steps to the throne room, stepping over broken rubble from the battered walls. The air was thick with dust. Inside the throne room, the remnants of House Lannister's guard made a final stand, but they were woefully outnumbered. Jaime Lannister stood among them, looking torn and weary, but determined. He threw down his sword at the sight of Jon and Daenerys. "It's over," he said, voice hoarse. "Cersei has nowhere to run." A flicker of sorrow crossed his face. He led them through the corridors, where they found Cersei at the window of a small solar, looking out over the city she had once ruled. She turned as they entered, her face pale but defiant. Daenerys stepped forward. "You lost," she said simply, voice echoing in the empty space. Cersei's lips curled in a snarl. "So, the Dragon Queen claims her throne," she spat. "Are you here to burn me alive? To be your father's daughter?" Daenerys clenched her jaw. She knew the weight of that insult. "No," she said, voice controlled. "I have seen enough death. I want justice, not murder." Jon stood at Daenerys' side, saying nothing, watchful. Cersei let out a bitter laugh, eyes flicking to Jon. "And you? The secret Targaryen, come to claim what's yours?" Jon shook his head. "I never wanted this," he said quietly. "I wanted to save the realm. That's all." Cersei's mocking smile wavered, replaced by desperation. "You can't win," she whispered. "A Targaryen on the throne will never hold the loyalty of all the lords. They'll turn on you like they did your father." Daenerys felt a pang, but she forced herself to remain resolute. "We will forge a new peace," she said. one built on unity, not fear. She looked at Jon, and in his eyes she saw the promise they had made to each other. She turned back to Cersei. Surrender the crown, stand trial for your crimes, or go into exile if the realm permits it. Cersei's face twisted. She was cornered, powerless. At length, she removed the golden crown from her brow, letting it drop to the stone floor with a dull clang. She sank to her knees, tears in her eyes. "Burn in hell," she hissed, voice trembling. Daenerys stepped away, revulsion curling in her stomach. She had not expected mercy to feel so fraught, but the scent of victory was tainted by the memory of all who had died. In the coming days, a council would convene to decide Cersei's fate. Daenerys intended to let the lords of Westeros judge her. She had no desire to be executioner and risk turning into a tyrant. The war was ended. The city was hers. But the path forward, the shape of the new realm, was uncertain. When the dust settled, Daenerys entered the throne room alone, her footsteps echoing. The Iron Throne stood there, battered yet still imposing. She approached it, recalling how once it was the symbol of all she desired. She reached out, fingers brushing the cold metal. Behind her, Jon appeared, his presence steadying. "It's yours," he said quietly. "You've earned it." She turned to face him, tears gathering in her eyes. "I'm not sure if it matters anymore," she whispered. "So many have died. I lost a dragon. We nearly lost everything. And now I'm here, touching this throne, and it feels hollow." Jon stepped closer, gently resting a hand on the hilt of Longclaw. "It doesn't have to be," he said. "You can do good with it. You can break the wheel like you always said." She looked into his eyes, seeing compassion, seeing trust, and she realized that whatever people sigh about their blood, about their claims, they stood a better chance of creating a just world together than apart. Slowly, she lowered her hand from the throne's arm. "We do it together," she said, voice trembling with conviction. "We show them that there is a better way." Outside, the bells still tolled, the city reeling from a new regime. The lords and ladies of Westeros would soon gather to see what shape this new rule would take. Some would clamor for Jon to sit upon the throne. Others would stand by Daenerys. Perhaps they would heed Tyrion's suggestion of forging an unprecedented arrangement, shared leadership, or a council to advise the monarchy, or some new formation that had never existed before. The future was uncertain, but Daenerys felt a spark of hope glimmer in her heart. She stepped away from the throne, turning to walk with Jon back into the broken courtyard, where the people waited to see what came next. Her body was heavy with exhaustion, her spirit scarred by all she had witnessed and lost. But she was alive. She had 2 dragons still breathing, and she was not alone. She thought of the day she learned the truth of Jon's heritage. Felt like a lifetime ago. That revelation had threatened to tear them apart before they truly came together. Instead, they had fought side by side, forging a bond stronger than claims and crowns. She reached for his hand, and he clasped it. They emerged into the daylight, where the hush of anticipation blanketed the shattered capital. Men and women, noble and common alike, turned to look upon the Targaryen queen and her newly revealed nephew. 2 survivors of the longest night, 2 figures who stood as living proof that unity could save them all. The last of the Lannister banners were cast down, and a new banner rose. The 3-headed dragon merged with the direwolf of House Stark, a symbol of alliance that no one in Westeros had ever seen. Daenerys held her head high, ignoring the dull ache of injuries not yet healed. This was the price of forging a new kingdom, and she had paid it willingly. Jon's voice rang out, strong and clear. "The war is over. The dead are gone. Cersei Lannister has surrendered. Let us now tend to the living, to rebuilding what was shattered. Let us restore peace to these lands." A ragged cheer rose from the crowd, and Daenerys breathed in the moment. She would have her work cut out for her, proving that she was not the Mad King's daughter. But with Jon at her side, Aegon Targaryen, the man who never desired the throne, she believed they could guide Westeros towards something better. She gazed at the battered walls of the Red Keep, the the city that her ancestors had taken with fire and blood so many generations ago. Now, perhaps it would be shaped by mercy and unity. She felt the faint brush of Jon's shoulder against hers, a silent reassurance that despite the complexities of their lineage, they had chosen to stand as one. Daenerys Targaryen looked upon the faces of those who watched her. Unsullied, Dothraki, Northerners, Southern lords, common folk, all of them uncertain but filled with a fragile hope. A sense of resolve blossomed within her. They had a chance to heal. They had a chance to be better than those who came before. And if the realm gave them that chance, she would not fail. Thus began the reign of a different Targaryen monarchy. One tempered by the horrors of the long night, shaped by the resilience of the North, guided by the unity of two rightful heirs who found common purpose in the greatest war of their age. Daenerys thought of the old prophecy that spoke of a prince or princess who was promised, of dragons and ice and fire. Perhaps that prophecy had been fulfilled not by a single champion, but by two souls linked by blood and united by fate. Regardless, the final war had been won with less devastation and more compassion than it might have otherwise. And that, Daenerys knew, was a victory beyond crowns. One that would echo through the ages of Westeros, lighting the path for generations to come. Daenerys Targaryen stood on the broad stone steps of the Red Keep's main courtyard, breathing in the heavy air of King's Landing. The city smelled of soot and sweat, fear and faint, lingering hope. Guards clad in Stark and Targaryen colors patrolled the walls. Lannister banners, what remained of them, had been taken down, rolled up in some corner of the keep, or simply trodden underfoot. A hush fell across the assembled crowd as Daenerys surveyed them. Her dark leathers and regal posture marked her as a queen, but she knew many in the city still thought of her as an invader. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, she reminded herself, stood at her side. He wore plain northern garb and a somber expression, but his posture was as unyielding as Winterfell's walls. His mere presence drew whispers, the rumored Targaryen prince who never wanted to be a prince at all. She did not miss the wary or curious glances cast his way by the courtiers who had hurriedly adapted to the new regime. They had arrived at this moment with fewer casualties than the history of Westeros might have predicted for such a grand conquest. Yet too much blood had already been spilled in battles against both the living and the dead. The common folk wore expressions torn between relief at the end of Lannister rule and uncertainty over what might replace it. Daenerys could almost feel their silent question. Are we exchanging one tyrant for another? She resolved in that moment to show them otherwise. She stepped forward, the sunlight catching in her silver gold hair. People of King's Landing, she said in a voice pitched to Carrie, I am Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen. You have seen war and destruction, famine and fear. I know many of you lost loved ones in battles you never asked for. Today, we begin our work to rebuild. The city gates will remain open for those who wish to return home, and aid will be distributed to all in need. The realm is scarred, but we will tend to these wounds together. A muffled sense of relief rippled through the crowd. She knew it would take much more than words to heal the damage or dispel the fear lingering beneath every question. But it was a start. Jon took a step forward, his black cloak stirring in the breeze. You have my word, he said, his voice not as loud as hers, but resonant with quiet conviction. That none shall be harmed for not taking arms against us. The war here is ended. You may set aside your fears. He hesitated. And should any remain loyal to the Lannisters out of desperation or fear, know you can lay down your arms without retribution. He did not invoke the Targaryen name. He never did, not unless pressed. Daenerys found herself torn between admiration for his humility and worry for what the lords of Westeros might do with the knowledge that his claim outranked hers. But as he spoke, she saw how the small folk watched him. This northern king who had championed them against the dead, who had stood beside the Dragon Queen to vanquish an ancient evil. No one erupted in cheers, but there were nods, a ripple of conversation. She saw children peering from behind a broken pillar, hopeful expressions lighting up their sooty faces. Even for that alone, the day felt like a triumph of sorts. The city was subdued but not entirely hopeless. After the brief address, Daenerys and Jon turned to re-enter the Red Keep. Grey Worm awaited them at the doorway, the sunlight glinting off his polished breastplate. His face betrayed no emotion, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "My queen, Ser Davos, requests your presence in the throne room. He says it is urgent." Daenerys arched an eyebrow and inclined her head in a nod. She had grown to trust Davos as a voice of reason, another anchor of practicality much like Tyrion. "Very well," she said. "Let us see what new surprises await." She glanced at Jon, who gave a subtle shrug, as if to say, "Let's find out." Together they made their way through the disordered corridors. Servants hurried to sweep up debris from the siege, while soldiers guarded every archway. The Red Keep bore the marks of battle, a scorched patch of stone where dragonfire had licked the ramparts, shattered windows from ballista fire, and yet it still stood, resolute. In the throne room, they found Davos with Tyrion, Gendry, and Brienne. The scattered remnants of Cersei's guard were nowhere to be seen. Cersei herself had been confined to a small tower room while the lords of Westeros decided her fate. Her surrender had come too late to spare her from judgment. For now, the queen in chains remained out of sight. Tyrion approached with a grim expression. "Your Grace," he said to Daenerys, then dipped his head to Jon. "We've received unexpected tidings from beyond the city." Davos cleared his throat, stepping forward. "It's the Golden Company. We've taken some prisoners. Their commander, Harry Strickland, surrendered himself after the city bells rang. But it seems a large portion of their mercenaries, those not trapped inside the city walls, have regrouped outside the main roads leading to King's Landing. They're demanding terms for their disbandment." Daenerys's brows drew together. She remembered the rumors that Cersei had hired the Golden Company with promises of great rewards. Evidently, many of those sellswords had scattered when the siege was lost, but not all. She was not eager for more bloodshed. They had just ended one war, and the entire realm still reeled from the greater war against the dead. But mercenaries who believed they could extort concessions would find her resolve unwavering. Tyrion shifted his weight. They're camped a few miles south along the Rose Road. Perhaps 2,000 men, maybe fewer. They sent a messenger demanding safe passage or gold in exchange for not continuing the fight in Cersei's name. They claim they're owed a contract fee. Jon grimaced. "We can't allow them to remain a threat, not so close to the city." He glanced at Daenerys. "At the same time, meeting them with immediate force might encourage them to burn farms on their way out. We should deal with them carefully." Daenerys nodded in agreement. "I've seen enough needless slaughter. We'll offer them a choice. Lay down arms, accept a fair wage to depart Westeros peacefully, or face the might of our combined forces. Drogon and Rhaegal remain enough of a deterrent, if we must display them." She felt a pang at the mention of her injured dragons. Drogon was still healing, and Rhaegal's wounds from battling Viserion had yet to fully mend. But the sellswords needn't know the extent of those injuries. Davos looked relieved that she was not leaping into vengeance. "Aye, that sounds wise. I can meet with them, speak their language of coin. You know my background, Your Grace. I wasn't born noble, and I know the ways of mercenaries. We might pay them off to ensure they leave quietly." Tyrion nodded. "Yes, an excellent suggestion. A chest of gold might prove a smaller price than another drawn-out skirmish. We can't rebuild King's Landing if we're worried about the Golden Company rampaging outside." Jon turned to Daenerys. "What say you? Do you approve Davos to speak for us?" She studied Davos with a small smile. "He's proven himself a skilled negotiator. Let him try. But if they show any sign of treachery, remind them we still have dragons." A new voice piped up from the side. "I'll go with him." All turned to see Gendry Baratheon, newly legitimized and uncertain in his stance, stepping forward. "I've some knowledge of mercenaries myself. Spent enough time around the sellswords in Flea Bottom, and I can remind them that House Baratheon stands with the Queen." He paused, flushing slightly under Daenerys' scrutiny. "If you'll allow it, Your Grace." She considered the young man who carried the Baratheon name with a mixture of pride and trepidation. He wore the Stormland's sigil now under her aegis, Very well. Go with Davos. Ensure this doesn't become another front of war. Brienne, who had been standing quietly beside them, added, I can accompany as well if you wish. An extra sword arm in case negotiations sour. Daenerys inclined her head. Do so. This realm has seen enough unnecessary slaughter, but we cannot be naive. And so it was decided. Davos, Gendry, and Brienne departed the throne room, leaving Daenerys, Jon, and Tyrion to plan the next steps for King's Landing. Tyrion drew in a slow breath. Your Grace, we must address the immediate needs of the small folk. The city stores have been raided by Cersei's men, leaving precious little to feed the refugees returning. We'll need to import grain from the Reach, from the Riverlands, and wherever we can find it. That means forging alliances or at least trade agreements. We should also see to the harbor. Blackwater Bay is half blockaded by debris from sunken ships. Commerce has stalled. Daenerys's mind whirred with the complexities of ruling. She had once imagined taking the throne as a swift, triumphant conquest. But the reality was heavier. A queen was not just a conqueror but a caretaker, a builder of roads and a provider of bread. Send word to the Tyrell bannermen who survived, to the Tarly lords who might still hold storehouses, to Dorne, she said, referencing the southern region that had indicated loyalty, though it still reeled from the losses of the Martell line. We'll pay fairly for supplies. I don't want another rebellion sparked by forced requisition. Tyrion nodded, scribbling notes on a parchment. We'll do it fairly, yes. As for the harbor, I'll see what engineers are left in the city. We can organize them to clear the wreckage. We might even salvage some of the ships for materials. Jon stood at her side, silent but attentive. When Tyrion paused, Jon spoke. We should also consider how to address our new seats of power. The North remains loyal to me, but the lords there will have expectations. They pledged themselves to the king in the North, not necessarily to the Iron Throne. And you, he added, looking at Daenerys with gentle eyes. You're here in King's Landing, fulfilling the destiny you always believed was yours. We have to reconcile these two loyalties if the realm is to remain stable. She heard the unspoken question, one that had hung between them since learning of Jon's parentage. What does it mean for us to rule together? She took a breath, her chest tightening at the memory of her father's madness, the years of exile, Viserys' cruelty, and her vow to be a different kind of Targaryen. If we are to break the wheel, she said quietly, perhaps we must start by acknowledging that one person cannot hold all power. The lords will want you as king in the North. My supporters wish me to sit on the Iron Throne. Could we consider a new arrangement? Tyrion's brows arched slightly, but he remained tactful. Many might suggest a marriage to unify claims, he offered, voice measured. It is not unprecedented among Targaryens, but times have changed. Others might propose a dual monarchy, though that concept is as foreign to Westeros as the idea of letting the North remain fully independent. The question is, would the realm accept a compromise? Daenerys felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. She had grown to care deeply for Jon, and she knew that forging a marital bond would quell many doubts about rivalry for the throne. But they were blood-related, aunt and nephew, a fact that churned uneasily in her gut. Targaryens of old would not hesitate, yet she was not like them. She did not want the rumor of madness or impropriety to overshadow the realm's fragile peace. Jon's face, too, flickered with a shadow of guilt whenever the topic hovered near. She stepped away from the table, pressing her palms against the cold surface of a broken marble column. I'm not sure, she admitted. For now, let us simply focus on rebuilding. The realm has been battered by the dead, then by war. I will not force a wedding upon myself or upon Jon if it causes the realm to question our sense of justice. We must build trust first. Jon offered a small nod of approval. She could see the relief in his eyes that they were not rushing into a union. Tyrion relaxed as well, though Daenerys suspected he might privately believe that a royal marriage was the most straightforward solution. Perhaps in time, if hearts and minds could be swayed. But for now, stability was more important than symbolic gestures. They continued planning through the day, cycling in officers who reported on damage in various quarters of the city, hearing urgent petitions from the returning smallfolk. The hours wore on, punctuated only by hasty meals and the arrival of new reports from the gates. Daenerys suppressed her weariness. She had grown used to pushing through exhaustion in her quest for the throne. Now that she held it, albeit in a precarious grasp, she found that the work doubled. There was always another matter to address, another crisis to avert. When evening fell, Daenerys slipped away from the Red Keep's main hall. She found Jon near one of the battered balconies overlooking Blackwater Bay. The city's harbor lights gleamed in the distance, fires flickering from braziers lit along the quays. Though the day was warm by northern standards, a chill breeze blew in from the water. Daenerys approached quietly, letting the hush settle around them for a moment. He turned his head, a faint smile curving his lips. "I was wondering when you'd come up for air," he said softly. She stepped beside him, leaning on the charred stone of the railing. "We've conquered a city, yet it feels like the real battle is just beginning. How many fires can we stamp out before something else sparks?" Jon exhaled. "I don't know, but we'll face it as we faced the dead. Together, step by step." His gaze drifted across the dark water. "I can't pretend I'm comfortable here in the south. The north is my home, Daenerys. And yet, I cannot abandon you to rebuild this realm alone." She felt a warmth blossom in her chest, tempered by the complexity of their situation. "I don't want you to abandon the north. I know you have your own seat, your own responsibilities. But I do want you near me." The admission felt raw, vulnerable. She remembered the nights they had shared aboard the ship to White Harbor, the quiet closeness formed in the aftermath of tragedy. Then the truth of his lineage had intervened, bringing an awkward distance. But beneath that tension, her feelings for him had not vanished. He reached out and took her hand, gently. "We can make this work," he said, voice low. "Perhaps we travel between Winterfell and King's Landing as needed. We ensure that both realms are tended. The wheel might not be broken in a single day, but we can reshape Westeros into something kinder." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of distant waves fill the silence. "I want that," she whispered. "More than anything." They stood like that for a while, the quiet companionship reminding her of the nights at Dragonstone when they had forged the earliest bonds of trust. The city below was still healing from the siege, but the horizon promised a new dawn. They would find their way. The next day brought fresh developments. Davos, Gendry, and Brienne returned from parley with the Golden Company. Their expressions were guarded, though not grim. Daenerys convened a brief council in a half-repaired courtyard, the better to enjoy the open air and keep an eye on incoming traffic at the gates. Grey Worm, Missandei, Tyrion, and Jon joined her, waiting for Davos's report. Davos inclined his head. The Golden Company agreed to disband, for a price. Apparently, they'd gotten word Cersei was defeated. Most of them have no desire to continue a hopeless fight. They want safe passage to return across the narrow sea to Essos. In exchange for not pillaging or forming a rebellion, they demanded gold they say Cersei owed them. We paid them half of what they wanted, enough to convince them to leave peacefully. Tyrion clucked his tongue. Half? That might rankle them. Gendry chimed in, arms folded. Davos and Brienne were persuasive. The company's commander recognized they had no real chance. "We sweetened the pot by offering a handful of Lannister warhorses that survived the battle, so they can sell them in Essos. They'll be gone within a fortnight." Daenerys felt a rush of relief. No more conflict to drain their resources and stain the realm with further blood. She nodded. "Well done. Let them depart under guard to ensure there's no trouble. Once they board their ships, they can have their gold and leave." Brienne added quietly, "They gave their word. Whether that word is worth much, I cannot say, but they were heavily outnumbered. They won't risk a final stand." She paused. "We have more pressing issues, perhaps, than a few mercenaries." "Such as Cersei Lannister," Tyrion said, finishing the thought. He glanced at Daenerys, then at Jon. The lords of Westeros are gathering to discuss her fate. Some have arrived already: Yohn Royce from the Vale, Lord Glover from the north, Edmure Tully from Riverrun, a small delegation from Dorne, and a handful of others. They want justice, or, at the very least, an accounting of her crimes. Daenerys felt the weight of that reality settle over her. Once, she might have executed Cersei on the spot, especially after all the cruelty and betrayal. But she was determined not to become the Mad King's daughter. Public justice, due process, that could not be a sham if she wanted to break the cycle of tyranny. "Then we shall hold a trial," she said, "in the same manner as we tried the slave masters in Meereen, a fair hearing with witnesses, though I doubt Cersei will say much in her defense." She looked at Tyrion. "You are her brother. Do you wish to speak for her?" Tyrion's face flickered with old pain. "I did once believe she might see reason, but she never did. I've no desire to defend her. Let her speak for herself if she must. My only concern is ensuring the proceedings appear lawful." Jon frowned slightly, crossing his arms. "The realm will want a verdict that punishes her. She brought the Golden Company here, refused to help fight the dead, caused the destruction of many houses. There's also the matter of the September of Baelor's destruction, which she orchestrated. That is a crime many have not forgotten. If we are to dispense justice for that..." Daenerys laid a hand against her breast, remembering the stories of Cersei's cunning and brutality, from blowing up the Sept to tormenting the Tyrells. And yet, she did not relish the notion of a vengeful public execution. "We hold the trial in a week's time," she declared. "Invite all lords who wish to bear witness. Let them see that we do not rule through fear alone." They agreed, and soon the Red Keep bustled with preparations for the unprecedented spectacle of a public trial for a deposed queen. Word spread through the streets that Cersei would face justice. As the days passed, more lords arrived, representing corners of Westeros once broken by war. Some came purely out of curiosity, others to ensure that the new Targaryen rule would not simply become another tyranny. Daenerys spent those days alternating between overseeing the distribution of grain and listening to the pleas of commoners who lined up outside the keep. Many had lost their homes in the final siege. She ordered new shelters to be built, employing carpenters and masons who were out of work due to the city's ruin. She also insisted that the Dothraki be given regulated quarters, with strict orders to keep the peace. The tension between the city dwellers and the fierce horse lords was palpable. Grey Worm managed the Unsullied with his usual discipline, ensuring they did not intimidate or harm the population. Jon threw himself into the same tasks, meeting daily with the northern lords who had come south and working with Tyrion to coordinate trade routes. Daenerys could see the strain in his features, the way each day seemed to add another layer of weight to his shoulders. But she also saw that people responded to him. Men and women who might look at her silver hair and recall the Mad King instead looked at Jon and saw a leader they trusted. Their dynamic, she realized, might be the realm's best chance for harmony. On the 7th day, the trial began in the throne room. The imposing hall had been partially repaired. The high windows still bore cracks, but fresh banners of the Targaryen sigil and the Stark direwolf combined were draped along the walls. Hundreds gathered, lords, knights, commoners, all craning their necks to glimpse the dethroned queen. Daenerys sat on the Iron Throne, an uneasy occupant, with Jon standing just a step to her right. Beneath and around them gathered Tyrion, Davos, Missandei, Grey Worm, Sansa, who had ridden south to see the outcome for herself, Arya and Bran Stark, who watched from a wheelchair near the dais. A hush settled over the hall. Cersei was led in by 2 unsullied guards. She wore a simple gray gown, her golden hair unkempt, eyes bloodshot. Her hands were bound, though no chains clattered at her ankles. She walked with the brittle dignity of one who still could not believe her world had ended. Jaime Lannister stood off to the side, guarded by Brienne, not as a prisoner but looking torn between duty and sorrow. A herald announced the proceedings in a wavering voice. "We gather to judge Cersei of the House Lannister for crimes against the crown, against the realm, and against the faith. Let it be known that the charges include the murder of King Robert Baratheon by conspiracy, the destruction of the Great September of Baelor, the usurpation of the Iron Throne, the betrayal of a pact to fight the undead, and countless acts that brought war upon the realm. Murmurs swept the hall. Cersei stood with her chin raised, gaze flicking to Daenerys. She seemed to search for some sign of fear or hatred there. Daenerys felt her heart pound, remembering how this woman had refused to aid them against the Night King, how she had hoped the dead would destroy her enemies. The tension in the hall was palpable. Tyrion stepped forward, not as her defender but as the hand of the queen. He read out the charges in detail, describing the events of the September's destruction. Nobles from the Reach confirmed that House Tyrell had lost nearly all its leadership in that blast. Others spoke of the death of Illyria Sand's daughters, though there were none left to speak for Dorne's pain but a young Lady Dane, who glowered at Cersei. There was also talk of how Cersei had consolidated power by fear, taking the Iron Throne without the consent of the realm. After all had spoken, Cersei was given her chance to respond. She swept her gaze around, face stony. "You call this justice?" she said in a low voice. "You, Daenerys Targaryen, who burned the Lannister army on the Rose Road, who destroyed Randall Tarly and his son, who threatened to burn King's Landing if it did not bend the knee. You dare to sit in judgment of me?" A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Daenerys swallowed, remembering that day when she had demanded the Tarlys bend the knee or die. She had believed it but she knew how it appeared to others. Still, she steadied her voice. "I gave the Tarlys a choice," she said, projecting calm. "You gave the people of King's Landing none. You destroyed the Sept and all who were inside. You planned to let the dead overrun us if it meant weakening your enemies." Cersei laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Is that what you all believe? That I had some grand plan to let the dead destroy us? I knew they were real, but how could I trust a foreign queen claiming to save the world? Every day in Westeros, lords wage war for crowns. I did what I had to do to protect my family, to protect my children. And yes, I brought the Golden Company here. I would have used every resource available to keep my throne. Is that so strange, to protect one's own power?" Someone in the crowd shouted, "Murderer!" Another demanded, "Have you no shame?" The tension grew. Jon's hand hovered near his sword, ready to quell any outburst. Daenerys caught Jaime Lannister's eye. He looked torn, as if he might speak, but he held his tongue. Tyrion continued, "You stand accused of regicide, of mass murder, of betraying the realm in its most dire hour. The question before us is not if you are guilty, your actions speak plainly. The question is how the realm shall punish you. If you have any final defense, speak it now." Cersei's lips curled. "My final defense is that all rulers are killers. Even the Starks, who claim to be so honorable, once put heads on spikes. Daenerys Targaryen, your father burned men alive in this very city. Why am I more guilty than they? Because I lost." She paused, letting the hush fill the hall. "I do not beg for my life. If this is justice, then do as you will. Hang me, burn me, makes no difference to me. My children are dead. This city never loved me. Do what you will and pretend you are more righteous." Her words left a sour taste in Daenerys' mouth. A part of her recoiled from the self-pitying scorn. Cersei was not wrong that many rulers had blood on their hands, but that did not absolve her. The hush deepened, and Daenerys felt every gaze upon her, felt the weight of the Iron Throne pressing against her shoulders. She wished that she did not have to decide alone. Yet she was queen, and the realm expected her to make the final call. Bran's soft voice broke the silence. "She is guilty." Heads turned. The young Stark's eyes were distant yet certain. "I have seen her deeds. She cannot undo them now." He did not elaborate further. He rarely did. But his words carried an eerie finality. Tyrion said quietly, "We must name her punishment, your grace." Daenerys rose from the throne. Her heart thundered. The realm would watch this decision as a test of her rule. Would she follow in the Mad King's footsteps, indulging in a sadistic execution, or would she show mercy to a woman who had nearly ruined the realm? She looked to Jon. His expression was solemn yet supportive. Then she looked at Sansa, who gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging that justice must be done. Daenerys inhaled slowly. "Cersei Lannister," she said, her voice echoing. "Your crimes have caused immeasurable suffering. By the laws of this realm, your punishment can be execution. Yet if I take your life with my own hands, it will not undo that suffering, nor bring back the dead. Some might clamor for your head. Others might see your death as too easy an end. I promise the realm a new era of justice, not cruelty. Thus, I decree you shall be exiled, stripped of all titles and claims, never again to set foot in the Seven Kingdoms. If you attempt to return, you will face immediate execution. Should any lord grant you shelter, they too shall be considered traitors." A roar of surprise erupted in the hall. Many expected an execution. Some cried out for blood. Others looked relieved or uncertain. Jaime Lannister let out a breath as if he had been holding it, but he did not openly rejoice. Tyrion's face was impassive, yet Daenerys saw a flicker of gratitude that she had not chosen a public beheading. Cersei's expression wavered for the first time. Perhaps she had expected an execution too. A dull hatred smoldered in her eyes. "Exile?" she repeated scornfully. "Where would I go?" Daenerys did not flinch. "Wherever you choose, as long as it is not in these lands. A ship will be provided, along with basic provisions. But you will have no gold, no retinue. You leave as a commoner, bearing the name Lannister in exile if you still choose to claim it." Cersei opened her mouth to speak, but whatever final barb she had prepared died on her tongue. She straightened her shoulders, affecting an air of dignity she no longer possessed, and said nothing. The lords of the realm murmured among themselves, many questioning if this sentence was too light. Others admired the show of mercy. Daenerys remained standing, gaze unwavering, letting the moment imprint itself on the minds of those present. She hoped this would signal the realm that she would not spill blood for the sake of spectacle or vengeance. But she also knew that some might see it as weakness. That was a risk she chose to bear. Grey Worm stepped forward with 2 unsullied guards. "We will escort the prisoner to a ship immediately, Your Grace." Daenerys nodded. "See to it, and ensure she has no chance to contact hidden allies." As the guards led Cersei away, she paused momentarily near Jaime. Their gazes locked for one heartbeat, an unspoken farewell charged with bitterness and regret. Then the guards pressed forward, and she disappeared through the great doors. Jaime remained behind, shoulders slumped, as if uncertain what to do next. Daenerys returned to the throne, though she did not sit. The crowd's chatter swelled, and she raised a hand for quiet. "The matter is decided," she proclaimed. "Let us now turn our efforts to rebuilding the realm. We have ended a war, and it is time to heal the wounds that have festered. Any who wish to speak of new grievances or alliances may do so in the days to come. I will hear your words, as will my counsel. For now, be at peace." She dismissed the gathering, and the hall slowly emptied. Many lingered to discuss the shocking sentence, but Daenerys kept her face composed, ignoring the swirl of rumors. She descended from the dais, relieved this part was over. Jon joined her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "You've shown her mercy," he said softly. "Some won't like it, but I think it was the right decision." She nodded, exhaling a shaky breath. Killing her might have satisfied a thirst for vengeance, but we must show the lords and the people that there is another way. She is broken, and the realm is better off sending her away than making a martyr of her. Sansa approached, her expression studious. "It was a bold choice," she said. "I admit I expected you to take her head." Daenerys managed a tired smile. "I am not my father." Sansa dipped her head in acknowledgement. "I see that." As the lords and spectators departed, Tyrion lingered with Missandei, a pensive look on his face. "We'll have to keep an eye on her. Ensure she doesn't slip back into Westeros under a false name," he mused. "But the cost of that watch is worth the statement you made." Grey Worm returned from giving orders to the guards. "Cersei will be placed aboard a ship bound for Essos under heavy escort. There is a harbor vessel that can sail with her by tomorrow's dawn. She'll have no coin, no army, nothing. His tone was neutral, but Daenerys caught a note of acceptance. He, too, had lost men to Cersei's schemes. Perhaps he took comfort in seeing her cast out. Thus, the dethroned queen was led away into an exile from which she might never return. Over the ensuing days, Daenerys hosted the lords who remained in King's Landing. Some pledged fealty to her directly, seeking favor or position in the new order. Others expressed their desire to keep the North a separate kingdom under Jon's rule, uneasy about being governed by a Targaryen. The city itself needed immediate attention. Large swaths of King's Landing had been damaged in the final days of the siege. The storehouses were nearly empty. Thousands had been displaced. Daenerys allocated funds and labor to rebuild the outer walls, to repair the main thoroughfares, and to restore the harbor. She formed an interim council that included Tyrion as Hand of the Queen, Davos to oversee trade and shipping, Missandei as the royal advisor, Gendry Baratheon to represent the Stormlands, and a rotating seat for northern lords so they would have a voice in southern affairs. Jon spent much of his time meeting with the knights and lords who had arrived from the north, discussing how best to restore normalcy there. Sansa had left Winterfell under the care of her bannermen, but she felt uneasy staying too long in King's Landing. Arya drifted through the city, unsettled by the crowds and the politics, preferring to train with Brienne or vanish on quiet errands. Bran spent more time in the Red Keep's Godswood, an ancient, twisted weirwood transplanted centuries before, often sitting silent while ravens fluttered nearby. Late one evening, Daenerys found herself pacing the corridors of the Red Keep, restless. The flickering torches cast wavering shadows on the walls. She had just left a meeting about the city's water supply, a trivial matter in the grand scheme, yet vital for the city to function. Her mind buzzed with 1,000 tasks, none of which felt truly resolved. She turned a corner and nearly collided with Jaime Lannister. He was no longer in gold armor, wearing instead a simple tunic with the Lannister lion embroidered on the breast. His face was gaunt, haunted. "My apologies, Your Grace," he said quietly, stepping aside. Daenerys steadied herself. "Sir Jaime." She took a moment to observe him. In another time, she might have harbored deep resentment toward him for his family's role in her father's death. But she remembered that her father had been the Mad King, and Jaime's killing of Aerys had saved thousands. She also recalled how he had fought beside them against the dead. "How are you faring?" He hesitated, as if uncertain she was speaking to him out of genuine concern. "I've been better. My sister is gone. Exiled." His voice cracked subtly. "And yet, it might be the best thing for the realm." Daenerys nodded. "I am not my father, but I carry the name Targaryen, and you once killed the man who bore it. Life is strange, isn't it?" Jaime glanced at her. "It is. I never thought I'd live to see another Targaryen on the throne." He paused, eyes distant. "Nor did I think I'd see my sister stripped of everything." She studied him. "What will you do now?" He exhaled slowly, as if he had asked himself that question 100 times. "I don't know. My honor, if I ever had it, was battered by the choices I made. I fought for the living against the dead, so I have that. But I also led the Lannister forces to war. There's no place for me in Casterly Rock. My father is gone. My house is in ruins. Tyrion is here serving you. I might serve you as well if you'll have me. Or I can go north and see if Sansa Stark will let me fight for the realm there." The corners of Daenerys's lips tugged downward thoughtfully. She recalled that Jaime had stood by Brienne's side to protect the Stark girls once. It was one reason Sansa did not revile him. "You have skill," she said, "and a name still recognized in the Westerlands. Rebuilding the realm will require all the help we can muster, especially if we are to keep the peace. If you wish to stay and serve, there could be a place for you." A ghost of a smile touched his face. "Peace. That word seems foreign to me." His gaze fell to his golden hand, glinting in the torchlight. "But I'm willing to try. If the realm can truly see peace at last, maybe it's time I learn to live in it." Daenerys inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Then speak to Tyrion. We'll find a role suited to your abilities. It's your choice." He bowed briefly, then stepped aside. She continued on her way, the echo of his footsteps fading behind her. She reflected on how life had changed so drastically in such a short span. Cersei dethroned, Jaime uncertain, Tyrion her hand, Jon revealed as a Targaryen. The realm stood on the precipice of transformat. Ion, and she was at the center of it. She would not allow failure. Too many lives depended on her now. The nights passed, turning into a cycle of incremental progress and new obstacles. Small councils convened daily to coordinate the city's reconstruction, and the combined armies of the North, Vale, and Targaryen loyalists began to disperse. Many northern soldiers longed to return home. Sansa was already speaking of the journey back to Winterfell before the snows grew too impassable. One morning, Jon arrived at Daenerys' door, looking troubled. She invited him in, dismissing the servants who scurried about. His face was shadowed with weariness, and she wondered if something dreadful had happened overnight. She gestured for him to sit on a cushioned bench near the window, where the morning light streamed through. He sank down, running a hand through his dark hair. "I've been talking to the Northern Lords, and they've made it clear they expect me to return before winter fully sets in. They're grateful for your help, but their loyalty is first to me, to the North. They want me to rule from Winterfell." He paused, looking up at her. "I want to do right by them, but I can't just abandon you." Daenerys' heart tightened. She felt the strain of the distance that would inevitably form if he left King's Landing. "I understand their concern," she said softly, seating herself beside him. "They named you king in the North, and that is no small honor. If you remain here, some might believe you've forsaken them." She searched his eyes. "What do you want to do?" He exhaled. "I want to see the North again. Winterfell, the crypts, the land I fought to protect from the dead. I want to ensure the harvest is secured before the worst of the cold sets in. See to the families who lost so much. But I also want to help you rebuild. The city is still fragile." She took his hand, feeling the calluses from sword practice. "What if we arrange our rule so that we split our time? We can travel together or separately as needed. The distance can be bridged by ravens, by a consistent exchange of letters and envoys. If there is an emergency here, you can fly south on Dragonback, or if there is a crisis in the North, I can come to you. Our realm must learn that the North is not separate from the rest, nor is King's Landing above the rest." He studied her face, relief flickering in his eyes. "You would do that?" She smiled faintly. "It is not the conquering I dreamed of when I was a child, but yes, I would. Westeros is vast. We cannot neglect any corner of it. We'll need to rely on those we trust. Tyrion, Davos, Sansa, the other lords, to oversee matters in our absence. We can do it if we plan carefully." Jon pressed her hand gently. "The North will rejoice to see you there. Once they understand you aren't coming as a conqueror but as an ally. Some will be slow to warm to the idea, but you've more than proven yourself by fighting the Night King. You saved us all from a fate worse than any southern rule." Daenerys lowered her gaze, remembering the horrors beyond the wall, the sight of Viserion's undead form. "I lost so much," she whispered. "But we won. That means something." He leaned closer, resting his forehead lightly against hers, a gesture that made her breath catch. It was so simple and tender. They lingered in that quiet closeness, the world outside the window bright with the promise of a new day. She could not deny the draw she felt toward him, the warmth that filled her chest. They had not truly discussed the nature of their bond since learning of his parentage, but in this moment, it mattered less than the fact they had survived together. In the corridor beyond, footsteps approached, and they separated, though not abruptly. A gentle knock sounded on the door, and Tyrion's voice came muffled through the wood. "Your Grace, if you have a moment." Daenerys stood, smoothing her dress. "Come in." Tyrion entered, taking in the scene with a quick dart of his eyes. He said nothing of Jon's presence, but the flicker in his gaze suggested he suspected something. "Pardon the interruption," he began, "but some representatives from the Westerlands just arrived, lesser bannermen of House Lannister, ironically enough. They request an audience about the current leadership in Casterly Rock." It appears the seat is effectively unclaimed. They want direction from the crown. Jon cleared his throat. If there's no Lannister to rule it, he trailed off. Tyrion smirked wryly. I am a Lannister, though I was never precisely welcome at the Rock. Jaime is also a Lannister, but he renounced his claim to the seat years ago. I doubt he wants to step into the role of a lord. Still, the Bannermen might prefer a name they recognize. Daenerys brushed a hand across her chin. They could be swayed to serve someone else if we convince them, but perhaps it's best for House Lannister not to vanish entirely. A stable lord in the Westerlands means more stability for the realm. Speak with Jaime, see if he's willing. If not, perhaps we can find another Lannister cousin to fill that seat. One who is willing to pledge loyalty to the new order. Tyrion bowed slightly. I'll see to it. I knew there would be 1,000 loose ends to tie up after we took the city, but every day I find 1,000 more. Daenerys sighed. That is the reality of rulership, it seems. Thank you, Tyrion. Keep me informed. He departed with a nod, closing the door gently behind him. Jon gave Daenerys a small smile. I'll leave you to handle your meetings. In a few days, Sansa and I plan to ride north. Will you come with us for a time? She hesitated, thinking of the repairs still needed in King's Landing. Then she thought of how it might strengthen the realm if she traveled to Winterfell soon. Yes, she said. I will. We can coordinate with Tyrion so that Davos and Missandei oversee progress here. I'll stay in Winterfell for a month, perhaps, see how the north fares. Then we can decide our next move. He touched her hand again, briefly, then left. She stood in the quiet, feeling both the weight and the possibility of this arrangement. She was no longer the sole Targaryen with a claim to the throne, but that no longer felt threatening. If anything, it felt liberating to share the burden with someone she trusted. 3 days later, preparations were made for the journey north. The combined armies had largely disbanded, though a small retinue of Unsullied remained to guard the queen. Some Dothraki followed her as well, but most had chosen to roam the open fields near the Crownlands, restless in the cramped city. The Northmen in King's Landing were more than ready to head home, and the city's residents were glad to see so many soldiers departing. Fewer swords in the streets meant less tension. Daenerys walked through the courtyard where her dragons rested. Drogon had nearly recovered from the spear wound inflicted by the Night King. The great black and red beast stretched his wings in the morning sun. Regal, his green scales dulled by scars, lurked on a far parapet, watchful. She approached Drogon, placing a gentle hand on the ridged scales of his neck. He rumbled in greeting. I'm sorry to uproot you again, she murmured, remembering that her dragons had grown used to warmer climes. But you'll like the north in summer, I promise. It's wild and open. No cramped city walls. Drogon flicked his tail, stirring up dust. She sensed his restlessness, a reflection of her own. The city was not his natural domain, nor was it truly hers, though she now ruled it. She heard footsteps and turned to see Jon approaching. He glanced at the dragon with cautious respect. He won't singe me, will he? He asked, half joking. Daenerys smiled. He knows you. He'll be fine. Jon stepped closer, letting his hand hover near Drogon's snout. The dragon sniffed, then gave a short snort that blew Jon's cloak aside. Daenerys laughed softly. Jon attempted a wry smile, though she saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. Memories of how close he had come to death beyond the wall still haunted him, no doubt. Regal, Drogon, and I will fly ahead, Daenerys said. We'll scout the roads for any sign of bandits or trouble. You, Sansa, and the soldiers can follow at a steadier pace. We'll wait for you near Moat Cailin. Jon nodded, adjusting his gloves. It'll be good to return home, though the memory of the dead still lingers there. The walls of Winterfell have seen too many battles. She studied his profile, the angular lines of his face. Then we'll aim to bring peace, if that is even possible in a world so used to war. Not long after, Daenerys mounted Drogon, feeling the exhilarating shift of power as the dragon bunched his muscles and leapt into the sky. Regal followed, his wings beating through the crisp morning air. She angled westward over the city, taking in the sight of King's Landing from above one last time before departing. It was a sprawl of chaotic streets and half-ruined districts. Even from this vantage, the battered walls and scorched patches were evident. She vowed to return in due time to oversee the reconstruction. For now, her eyes lifted to the open horizon, the promise of a new journey north. She and her dragons soared above the Rose Road, scanning for any sign of trouble. Occasionally, Drogon swooped lower, and travelers looked up in awe or terror. Yet none shot arrows or threatened them, a sign that the realm was at least momentarily at peace. She guided the dragons to a clearing near an old watchtower when dusk approached, letting them rest while she made a small camp. Rhaegal perched on a rocky outcropping, gazing warily at the darkening skies as if expecting more undead terrors. Daenerys unrolled a blanket beside the remnants of a crumbling wall. She had grown adept at traveling light, the queen of dragons, camping out under the stars. Once it would have been unthinkable, but now it felt almost freeing. As twilight deepened, she gazed into the flickering embers of her fire, remembering the nights she'd spent traveling across Essos, forging alliances to take back Westeros. Now here she was, the occupant of the Iron Throne, heading to the north not to subjugate it but to support its people and stand beside Jon. She dozed fitfully, waking at intervals to check on the dragons. Near dawn, she saddled Drogon once more, and they took flight. The sun rose over rolling hills and winding rivers. The roads below led ever northward. She thought of the first time she had seen the north, how stark and cold it had been, how the people had eyed her with suspicion. This time, she hoped her welcome might be warmer. Eventually, she landed at Moat Cailin, the ancient stronghold that served as the southern gateway to the north. It was partially in ruins, its towers looming like dark sentinels. The small garrison stationed there recognized her at once, news of her arrival having preceded her by Raven. They offered her a place to rest, though the accommodations were sparse. Rhaegal and Drogon roost beyond the walls, earning wide-eyed stares from the soldiers. Daenerys settled herself in a crude chamber, awaiting Jon and Sansa's arrival. Days passed, during which she walked the ramparts of Moat Cailin, conversed with the garrison's captain about local banditry, and wrote letters updating Tyrion on her progress. Each evening, she visited her dragons, who had taken to hunting in the nearby marshes, returning at dusk with the spoils of their hunts. She found a curious sense of peace in these quieter routines, far from the bustle of King's Landing. On the third day, scouts announced that the royal procession approached. Daenerys donned her heavier northern cloak against the chill air and climbed the battered walls to watch their arrival. Banners snapped in the breeze, the direwolf of House Stark, the dragon of House Targaryen. Jon rode at the front, alongside Sansa and Arya. Davos was there, and Brienne, leading a contingent of knights. The sight warmed Daenerys in a way she could not quite explain. Jon dismounted and made his way up the winding steps to join her on the rampart. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, dark hair ruffled by the wind. "You're punctual," he observed with a ghost of a smile. She raised an eyebrow. "I've been here for 3 days. Had you traveled faster, you might have caught me napping." He chuckled softly, then gestured to the men behind him. "We'll rest here for a night. The horses need it after the march. Then we'll continue to Winterfell. Sansa's anxious to see how the harvest fares." Daenerys regarded the men who were unloading supplies, the banners swaying overhead. "I look forward to seeing Winterfell again. The crypts, the weirwood trees." Her gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the sky was growing thick with gray clouds. "We should hurry before the snow makes travel impossible." He nodded. "We can leave at first light tomorrow." That evening, she shared a simple meal with Jon, Sansa, and Arya in the old hall of Moat Cailin. The talk revolved around the state of the North, stories of how the White Walkers' invasion had left villages abandoned, how rebuilding was a slow and somber affair. Sansa said the Umbers and Karstarks were struggling to repopulate their lands after the slaughter. Arya rarely spoke, mostly listening with a guarded expression. Daenerys sensed that the younger Stark girl remained ambivalent about her. respectful but not quite friendly. After supper, Daenerys wandered outside the walls to see her dragons. She found Jon there, too, perhaps drawn by the sight of them perched in the moonlight. Drogon's huge form loomed like a living shadow, and Rhaegal's green eyes caught the moon's reflection. Jon approached slowly. "It still stuns me to see them," he murmured. "Such power, yet they trust you." She reached out to stroke Drogon's flank, feeling the deep rumble of his breathing. "They are my children," she said, "but they're also reminders of what I carry with me. Fire and blood." She looked at Jon. "I'm trying to use them for good, not fear." He gazed back at her, candlelight flickering in his dark eyes. "You've shown mercy, even when it was risky. People in the north will see that. Some might remain wary, but they'll see." They stood in silence, side by side, the chilly wind tugging at their cloaks. The dragons shifted occasionally, stretching wings or blinking at the stars. Daenerys felt a quiet comfort in the moment, a sense that they were forging something new, beyond the cycles of vengeance that had plagued their families. The next morning, they continued their journey, a column of riders and wagons winding northward. Daenerys soared overhead on Drogon, scanning the land for any trouble. Rhaegal flew behind, though his flight was slower than Drogon's, still favoring a wing that hadn't fully healed. When they reached the lands just south of Winterfell, she marveled again at the transformation of the terrain. The rolling hills dusted with snow, the winding rivers crusted with ice. Far in the distance, the silhouette of Winterfell stood proud, steam rising from its hot springs. They arrived at the castle gates in the afternoon. Guards recognized them immediately. The portcullis rose, and the courtyard filled with onlookers. Old faces, new ones. Some knelt or bowed, others simply stared. Daenerys dismounted and found her breath pluming in the frigid air. She pulled her fur cloak tighter, grateful for its warmth. Jon and Sansa dismounted as well, greeting the guards. The sense of home that washed over Jon was evident in his eyes, and he briefly embraced some of the soldiers who had returned earlier. Daenerys smiled, watching him. This was where he belonged, at least part of him. No matter his bloodline, he was of the North in spirit. Sansa took command at once, speaking to the steward about provisions and the stables. Arya slipped away, presumably to check on something that needed no explanation. Daenerys allowed Missandei and a few of her unsullied retinue to handle her own possessions. She glanced around, recalling the last time she had been in this courtyard, preparing for the battle against the dead. It felt like decades ago, though only months had passed. Grey Worm and several Unsullied who had followed her north stood quietly, uncertain in the face of the northern stairs. Daenerys stepped to them, offering a reassuring nod. "We'll find quarters for you," she told Grey Worm. "It won't be like King's Landing, but they'll be warm and safe." He inclined his head. "Thank you, my queen." Not long after, Daenerys found herself in the Great Hall of Winterfell, reminiscent of a time when the lords had gathered to discuss alliances. The air was thick with the memory of Ned Stark's legacy. She sat at the high table beside Jon, who wore the mantle of king in the north. Sansa presided on his other side, flanked by local lords eager to speak. A communal meal was laid out, simple fare of stews, roasted vegetables, and crusty bread. The conversation at first was stiff, many reluctant to treat Daenerys with the same warmth they showed Jon. But she made a point to ask after their needs, ensuring that the crown would assist if famine or bandits threatened. Slowly, she sensed the mood lighten. The mention of how she had fought the Night King with dragons thawed some hearts. None had forgotten the terror of the undead. After dinner, Jon led her to the ramparts, the same walkway where she had once watched her dragon swirl above the snowy fields. The sky was darkening, and a crisp wind swept the battlements. Below, the flickers of lanterns and torches lit the courtyard. She peered across the expanse of white-limbed fields. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Harsh, but beautiful." Jon stood close enough that she could feel his warmth. "It's my home, and it can be yours too, whenever you wish." She glanced at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. I want the North to see me not as a conqueror, but as someone who cares. I fought for them once. I'll do it again if need be. He lifted a hand as if to brush her cheek, then hesitated, aware they were in public. Instead, he let his hand drop. They'll see. Time will help. With the dead gone and Cersei exiled, we finally have a chance for peace. We just have to keep it. She nodded, letting a subtle smile cross her lips. Yes, keep it by building new bonds. They lingered a while, talking of small matters, the condition of Winterfell's outer walls, the supplies in the crypts, the possible arrival of a new maester. Daenerys enjoyed the simplicity of these concerns, so different from the cutthroat intrigues of King's Landing. A new life, however temporary, spread out before them. In the days that followed, Daenerys rode through nearby villages with Jon, offering aid and coin to repair homes lost in the battles. At first, the villagers approached with caution, but once they recognized the king in the north and his queen, they knelt or bowed and then shyly expressed gratitude. Children stared in wonder at the dragons circling overhead. The cold was bitter, but Daenerys found a certain warmth in the genuine welcomes she received. She had grown used to grand conquests in Essos, to the mass liberation of slaves. Here, the needs were smaller. A new roof, a cask of salted fish to feed a hungry family, a barn to house livestock. Yet the gratitude was just as profound. At Winterfell, she spent time conferring with Sansa about harvest distributions, bridging the realm's resources with what was needed in the north. She even found a quiet moment with Arya, who regarded her with the same measured stare. Arya said, "You came back even though you could have stayed in the south on your throne. You must care more than I thought." Daenerys smiled faintly. "I do care. This is Jon's home, and he is important to me." She avoided the word love, uncertain how Arya might react. But Arya only gave a small nod, as if she'd gleaned that truth on her own. Bran, too, watched the unfolding dynamics from his quiet vantage. Now and then, he would comment about the future, or about the crows that gathered near the wall, but Daenerys found his cryptic observations difficult to parse. One day, she saw him under the weirwood tree, eyes rolled back in a warg-like trance. She stood at a respectful distance until he emerged, blinking in the pale light. His gaze drifted to her. "The realm is quieter now," he said in his soft, emotionless tone. "No white walkers, no dragons turning to ice. Yet I see shadowy shapes moving in Essos, in the east armies stirring." A flicker of alarm coursed through Daenerys. Armies stirring? For war? He tilted his head, as though listening to some distant music. The world is never truly at peace, but that is far away for now. She pressed him gently for more details, but he only shook his head. His gift and burden often showed him fragments that might not manifest for years. She filed away his words, wondering if one day their attention might be drawn across the narrow sea again. When a fortnight had passed, and the north seemed relatively settled, Daenerys received a raven from Tyrion. He reported that King's Landing's reconstruction was moving apace, the roads were safer, and the Golden Company mercenaries had departed Essos-bound ships. He also noted that tensions in Dorne were rising. Some lords there had grown accustomed to the idea of independence during the wars, and they wondered if they should remain under Targaryen rule. Daenerys shared the letter with Jon. "We can't remain in Winterfell indefinitely," she said. "The realm is vast, and it needs guidance." She paused, looking at him uncertainly. "But I know your place is here." He considered the letter. "Dorne chafing under rule is nothing new. But you're right, we can't let the realm drift apart. Perhaps we visit Dorne next, or invite them to a meeting in King's Landing. Show them that we aren't ignoring their concerns. As for me, I can stay or go with you. The North is stable for now, especially with Sansa's leadership. If you wish for me to accompany you, I will." She thought of traveling to Dorne, a land of desert and sun-scorched mountains, so different from the North. "We could use a show of unity," she said slowly. "If we appear divided, one in the North, one in King's Landing, Dorne might decide to break away entirely. But I don't want to drag you everywhere if your heart remains here. He stepped closer, setting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. My heart is with my people, and also with you. He hesitated, a small smile crossing his lips, as though referencing the complexity of them being both Targaryens and something more than mere allies. We agreed to share this burden, to rule together in some form. Let's do it. We can see Sansa well established and ensure the North knows we haven't abandoned them. Then we ride south again. If Dorne wants a voice, we'll give them one, and they'll see both of us listening. She felt a rush of gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Truly. So they assembled a plan. Sansa, acting as Lady of Winterfell, would keep the North running in their absence. Arya had no desire to linger, and she hinted she might travel west of Westeros eventually, though for now she stayed near her family. Bran was content to remain in Winterfell, close to the weirwood. Daenerys and Jon would gather a small retinue and return to King's Landing, from which they could address the concerns of Dorne, the Reach, and any other region uncertain about Targaryen rule. The day before they set out, Daenerys took a solitary walk around Winterfell's snowy courtyard, bidding silent farewells to a place that had grown oddly comforting. Ghost, Jon's direwolf, prowled by a stable door, regarding her with crimson eyes. She reached out a cautious hand, but the wolf slunk away. She smiled wryly. Perhaps direwolves weren't as easily tamed as dragons. She was about to return inside when she heard a rustle of footsteps. Turning, she saw Sansa standing there, pale cloak draped over her shoulders, red hair catching the afternoon light. I wanted to speak with you before you left, Sansa said. Daenerys nodded. Of course. Sansa stood a few paces away, arms folded as though bracing against the cold. I won't pretend I fully trust any Targaryen. You must understand that my family has reasons to be wary. But I see that Jon trusts you. More than that, I see that you saved us all from the dead and from Cersei's cruelty. You gave us your dragons and your armies, and you continue to show compassion where I expected only conquest. She paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. I wanted to say that I appreciate what you've done. For the North, for Jon. And I want the realm to remain at peace. Daenerys studied her, sensing the sincerity in her voice. I understand your concerns. My father gave the Targaryen name a horrible legacy to overcome, and my own approach to conquest in Essos was often harsh. I have no desire to see the North suffer. Jon means a great deal to me, and your family has faced enough tragedy. If I can help the North flourish, I will. Sansa lowered her gaze. And if one day, the North decides it wants to be fully independent, will you stand in our way? Daenerys' heart gave a painful twist. She recalled how the Seven Kingdoms had once been united under Targaryen rule. Yet the North had never fully forgotten its ancient status as a kingdom. I can't answer that now, she admitted honestly. We're trying to build something new, a realm where all the kingdoms can coexist without tyranny. If that means the North eventually wants to govern itself, perhaps we can negotiate a peaceful arrangement. But for now, we need unity, especially after the devastation we've all faced. Sansa's lips thinned, but she nodded in agreement. Fair enough. At least you're not threatening to burn us if we disagree. That's more than many past rulers would say. She extended a hand, and Daenerys accepted it. They clasped hands briefly, cold flesh meeting warm. Safe journey, Daenerys Targaryen, Sansa said softly. Look after Jon. A small smile touched Daenerys' lips. I will. And thank you for looking after the North. Sansa withdrew her hand and turned toward the keep, leaving Daenerys standing there with a swirl of emotions. Gratitude, trepidation, relief. Perhaps the Stark lady had not become a friend, but at least they had found mutual respect. The next morning, Daenerys and Jon departed Winterfell with their retinue. Drogon and Rhaegal soared overhead, casting colossal shadows on the snow-dappled fields. The northern lords gathered in the courtyard to bid farewell. Sansa, Arya, and Bran stood at the gate, watching silently as their brother rode out with the Dragon Queen at his side. The journey south was less fraught than before, with the roads somewhat repaired and fewer roving bands of hungry men. News of peace in King's Landing had spread, and though some brigands still lingered, the realm felt on the verge of genuine calm for the first time in years. Now and then, Daenerys took flight with Drogon to scout, but she spent more time riding beside Jon, sharing stories of their experiences in Essos and the North, of their lost families and the new alliances they hoped to forge. Took them weeks to reach King's Landing. When they finally arrived, Tyrion met them at the gates, wearing a relieved smile. "The city missed you," he said, though there was a hint of irony in his tone. "Reconstruction continues. We've begun clearing more ruins in Flea Bottom, aiming to build better housing. And Dorne has sent an envoy. They're waiting in the Red Keep." Daenerys sighed wearily. "We'll meet them tomorrow. Tonight, I want to see how my people fare." She glanced at Jon, who nodded in agreement. Together, they rode through the city streets, which were markedly less tense than before. Smoke from forges and ovens drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of fresh bread. People still looked thin, the scars of war evident in half-collapsed homes, but there was movement and commerce. Vendors hawked wares, children scampered in alleyways. As Daenerys passed, some knelt or bowed. Others simply gazed with cautious respect, apparently recognizing her silver hair and the presence of her dragons overhead. She felt Jon's sidelong glance. "They're not running inside or shouting curses," he noted quietly. "That's progress, I suppose." She exhaled a half-laugh. "Yes, I'll take it as a good sign." By the time they reached the Red Keep, darkness was settling. The keep's repairs had advanced. Scaffolding lined the walls where masons worked by torchlight. Within the throne room, Daenerys found new banners, the Targaryen dragon displayed more prominently, but also small flags representing each region. The direwolf for the north, the fish of Tully, the sun and spear of Dorne, the falcon of the Vale, the kraken of the Iron Islands, the rose of Highgarden. Though the Tyrells were gone, the sigil remained, and the stag of Baratheon. She approved of the gesture, unity, not subjugation. Jon parted ways to settle the northern retinue in the guest quarters. Daenerys spoke briefly with Tyrion about the developments in her absence. He explained that the Ironborn, led by Yara Greyjoy, had secured the seas around the Iron Islands and expressed loyalty to the new rule, provided that the Iron Islands were largely left to govern themselves. Dorne, meanwhile, had grown fractious in the wake of the deaths of the Martells, with multiple houses jockeying for power. The leader of the envoy waiting in the keep was a certain Lord Santagar, who hoped to unify Dorne's scattered banners under a single voice. Daenerys retired to her chambers that night, mind buzzing with the knowledge that her next challenge lay in forging a lasting alliance with Dorne. As she prepared for bed, she heard the distant roar of her dragons echo across the night sky. A subtle smile crossed her lips. They were free to roam, her children, but they always returned. In many ways, she felt the same. She had roamed, she had conquered, but she always returned to the seat of her rule to face the next task. She settled on the bed, pondering the complexities of the realm and the question of what shape her final rule would take. Sleep came slowly, memories drifted. The cold of the north, the swirl of snow, the crypts of Winterfell, the hush of the Godswood. She remembered Sansa's half-guarded acceptance, Arya's silent watchfulness, Bran's cryptic visions. She thought of Jon's steadfast presence, the way his dark eyes warmed when he looked at her. She recalled the day she had learned his true name, Aegon Targaryen, and the swirl of emotions that had threatened to drown her. Now, that shock had settled into a strange sense of shared destiny. Perhaps it was not so complicated in the end. They both wanted the same thing. A stable, just realm where children would not fear the undead or the ravages of endless war. In the morning, she awoke to rays of sunlight cutting across the room. She dressed in a new gown, deep red with subtle black trim, comfortable yet regal, and met Jon for a quick breakfast of bread, cheese, and fruit. Together, they strode into the throne room, where Tyrion, Davos, Missandei, and Grey Worm awaited them. At the foot of the dais stood a cluster of Dornish nobles, identifiable by their flowing robes and the sun-scorched tones of their skin. Lord Santagar, a man of middling years with a trimmed beard, stepped forward, flanked by 2 other lords. They bowed low. "Your Grace," Lord Santagar said, his accent carrying the rolling warmth of Dorne. "We come on behalf of the Dornish houses who seek to re-establish our governance since the deaths of Prince Doran and his heirs. We welcome your reign, provided you respect Dornish customs and our right to self-rule in internal matters." Daenerys descended from the throne, not wanting to tower over them. Jon remained beside her, a silent testament to their partnership. "Lord Santagar," she said, "Dorne's independence of spirit is well known. I have no desire to quash your customs or traditions. If you recognize the crown's authority in matters that affect the realm as a whole, war, trade, alliances, then I see no reason to interfere in your local governance." He inclined his head. "That is precisely what we had hoped to hear. We do ask for certain trade concessions. We want the right to set tariffs for exports of our wine and citrus without interference from the crown. In exchange, we will offer a significant portion of our harvest to aid in feeding King's Landing during its rebuilding." Tyrion stepped forward, glancing at Daenerys for permission to speak. She gave a slight nod. "We can negotiate the specifics," Tyrion said smoothly, "but the principle is agreeable. Dorne's produce is valuable. The crown will benefit from open trade, and King's Landing needs the supplies. I'm sure we can find terms that satisfy everyone." Lord Santagar smiled, the tension in his posture easing. "Thank you, my lord. We also request that you send a royal envoy to Sunspear to witness our new leadership council and formalize these agreements with a signature. It would do much to quell any lingering concerns among our banners." Daenerys exchanged a glance with Jon. Traveling to Dorne might be the next logical step in forging unity, though the realm was vast and her time was limited. Tyrion seemed to read her thoughts. "I could go, if you wish, as Hand of the Queen with Davos and perhaps a small escort. Missandei can handle the documents. You and Jon can remain here to solidify matters in King's Landing, or if you prefer, you can travel as well." Daenerys folded her hands. "Perhaps you should go first, Tyrion. Establish the framework. I'll consider traveling after I've seen how the city's reconstruction stands and if any new crises emerge. Dorne will want reassurance that they're not being ignored, and a visit from the Hand of the Queen should suffice for now." Lord Santagar nodded graciously. "We will welcome you, Lord Tyrion, and in time, the presence of the Queen will be met with great celebration in Sunspear." Daenerys thanked them, and the discussion moved to details of shipping routes and the security of roads through the Stormlands. She let Tyrion handle the bulk of negotiations, occasionally interjecting to confirm her stance on a matter. Jon stood quietly, watchful and stoic, his presence a subtle reminder that the North and the Crown were aligned. When the meeting concluded, Lord Santagar and his retinue departed with visible relief. Tyrion turned to Daenerys, a trace of amusement in his eyes. "We're almost starting to sound like a functioning monarchy. Negotiations, trade agreements, envoys. No talk of war or dragons burning down keeps." Daenerys allowed a weary smile. "Don't jinx it." She turned to Jon, letting her gaze linger. "Perhaps this is how we truly break the wheel, by allowing each region more freedom under a unified realm, rather than forcing them all under an iron fist." Jon reached out and briefly brushed her hand. "It's worth trying." She nodded. "We'll have to remain vigilant. Peace is fragile." Tyrion gave a small bow. "I'll make preparations to depart for Dorne within the week. In the meantime, you two can oversee the final stages of clearing debris in the city, meeting with the lords who still linger in the Crownlands, and continue forging alliances. Such is the life of a ruler, I'm afraid." Daenerys exchanged a look with Jon, recalling that moment on the boat when he had first offered her fealty. So much had happened since then. "We'll manage," she said, a quiet confidence in her voice. As Tyrion walked away with Missandei, Davos trailing behind, Jon turned to Daenerys with a faint smile. "A queen's work is never done." She laughed softly, though a hint of exhaustion tugged at the edges of her senses. "Nor is a king's, it seems." He nodded. "The realm depends on us now. Let's not fail them." She leaned into him, just enough for a moment of private closeness in the echoing throne room. The Iron Throne loomed behind them, a symbol of power that both united and divided. Yet as she rested her hand on Jon's forearm, Daenerys felt a flicker of hope that they were forging a future different from the bloody past. If the coming days demanded more of them, so be it. They had survived the long night, the threat of the dead, the fall of Cersei. They would survive the challenges of peace as well. In the days and months that followed, Daenerys and Jon established a new rhythm of governance. Tyrion departed for Dorne, signing trade pacts and ushering in a period of cautious optimism among the Dornish lords. Gendry Baratheon managed the Stormlands with Davos's help, ensuring roads were maintained and bandits suppressed. Yara Greyjoy secured trade routes by sea, occasionally sending ravens requesting fewer restrictions on the Ironborn's maritime freedoms. Edmure Tully wrote from Riverrun, confirming the Riverlands were recovering from the devastation wrought by the wars. In King's Landing, Daenerys personally supervised the clearing of rubble in Flea Bottom, ordering new housing constructed with city funds. She insisted on transparency, creating a rudimentary office for complaints and petitions. It was a far cry from the politics of Meereen or Yunkai, but she adapted, remembering how she had once freed entire cities of slaves. Here, the chains were not literal, but the cycle of poverty was still oppressive. Jon joined her in these efforts, a silent but reassuring figure whose presence calmed the city's inhabitants. Many recognized him as the hero who had risked everything beyond the wall. Late at night, when the day's duties were done, they would find quiet corners of the Red Keep or stroll along the parapets, discussing the realm's progress and their own uncertain future. The question of marriage lingered between them, unspoken yet potent. Some lords quietly suggested they formalize their alliance by wedding, unifying the Targaryen claim and the North's loyalty. Others hinted that the notion of Targaryen incest would scandalize the realm, risking a backlash. But Daenerys and Jon had not pressed the matter. Perhaps they were content, for now, to rule side by side without a formal ceremony, forging trust in the realm before complicating matters. They had time. The dead were gone, and a fragile peace blossomed. The wheel had not been fully broken, but maybe it had been unbound enough to let the realm breathe. One evening, as the city settled into the hush before curfew, Daenerys ascended to the Red Keep's highest balcony. From there, she could see the sprawl of streets and rooftops, the shimmering bay reflecting moonlight. Drogon and Rhaegal were perched on the distant battlements, content after a long day's flight. The wind stirred her hair, carrying the scent of salt and the faint echo of the city's nighttime bustle. She closed her eyes, letting the cool air wash over her. Footsteps approached. She turned to see Jon, clad in a plain cloak, stepping onto the balcony. He smiled, stepping beside her to survey the city. The moonlight accentuated the tired lines beneath his eyes, but also the quiet resolve he wore like armor. "Sometimes I look at this city," Daenerys said softly, "and I recall the stories my brother told me, how our family built it, how my ancestors ruled from the Iron to Rome. He spoke of it as a place stolen from us. But now, standing here, I realize it was never about a single family. This city belongs to those who dwell in it, to the thousands of souls who call it home. We're just caretakers, passing through, doing the best we can." Jon nodded, turning to face her. "You're not your brother, nor are you your father. You've proven that." She reached out, letting her hand rest against his chest. His heart beat steadily beneath her palm. "And you've proven you're more than your name, Aegon Targaryen. You're still Jon Snow, the man who keeps his word, who defies all odds to protect the realm." He leaned closer, voice hushed. "We might have changed the course of history. No more White Walkers, no more cruel Lannister rule. A chance for people to live without constant fear." A gentle breeze curled around them, and Daenerys felt a surge of emotion. She thought of all she had lost: Viserion, Yora, Missandei's home across the sea, the illusions she once held about a glorious conquest. Yet she had also gained allies, found a love she never expected, and discovered a purpose deeper than any throne. She raised her face to his, and they shared a tender kiss, slow and cautious, as if acknowledging the uncertain future they faced. The city below was quiet, the flickering lights like stars fallen to earth. Drogon let out a distant rumble, and Regal answered, their voices echoing across the roofs. Daenerys broke the kiss, resting her forehead against Jon's. We have work yet to do, she whispered. A realm to guide, a new era to shape. He smiled against her cheek. We'll do it together, always. And so they stood, two Targaryens in a city once lost to their house, forging a reign unlike any Westeros had known before. Their final war had reshaped them, revealing truths both painful and unifying. The past was soaked in blood, the future uncertain, yet they held fast to hope. The night sky stretched overhead, vast and glittering, and in that quiet moment, they allowed themselves to believe that they had indeed taken the first steps toward breaking the wheel, and that the realm, at long last, might know a peace worthy of